October 12, 1838, marked the unceremonious entry of Charles Kennedy into the world, born within the humid, timber-choked isolation of the Tennessee hills. He arrived as a large, silent infant in a cabin constructed of rough-hewn logs that failed to keep out the damp chill of the autumn nights. His family existed on the fringes of the county, scraping a living from soil that was more limestone rock than fertile earth, a reality that dictated a life of ceaseless grinding labor from the moment a child could walk. The Kennedy household was a place devoid of affection or softness, governed by a father who viewed his offspring not as children to be nurtured but as hands to be put to work. Charles grew up under the constant threat of physical discipline, learning early on that the only authority recognized in his world was the weight of a closed fist or the sting of a leather strap. He did not cry when he was struck. Instead, he developed a thick-skinned resilience, a heavy silence that settled over him like a coat of iron. By the time he was 6 years old, he was already hauling water from the creek and clearing stones from the fields, his hands growing calloused and rough before he had ever held a book or a toy. The environment of his youth was one of sensory brutality, where the cycles of life and death were displayed with graphic clarity. Charles watched his father slaughter the livestock in the late autumn, standing close to observe the process with a detached, clinical interest. He saw the way the pigs struggled against the rope, the specific angle of the knife required to sever the vein, and the massive amount of blood that soaked into the dirt of the pen. These were not traumatic events for the boy. They were lessons in the mechanics of dominance. He understood implicitly that the creature holding the blade possessed absolute power, while the creature beneath it possessed nothing. He saw that mercy was a luxury that did not exist in nature, and certainly not on a failing farm in the Tennessee backwoods. As he grew into his teenage years, his body responded to the hard labor by becoming unusually dense and muscular. He was broader across the shoulders than any of his peers, with a neck thick from lifting timber and legs hardened by walking miles over broken terrain. He was a physical anomaly, a giant in a community of malnourished farmers, and this physical superiority began to breed a dangerous arrogance within him. Education was non-existent for Charles Kennedy. He never learned to read the scriptures or sign his name with any fluidity, but he became an expert in the geography of violence. He learned the sound a bone makes when it snaps under pressure, and the specific gasp of a man who has had the wind driven from his lungs. His exit from Tennessee was precipitated not by a desire for exploration, but by an explosion of the rage that had been festering inside him for 2 decades. In the summer of 1857, a dispute arose with a neighbor over the ownership of a stray calf. The argument took place on a dusty road under the sweltering heat of July. When the neighbor, a man twice Charles's age, raised a hand to shove him, Kennedy reacted with a ferocity that stunned the onlookers. He did not simply defend himself. He dismantled the man. He drove his fist into the neighbor's face with the force of a sledgehammer, shattering the nose and cheekbone instantly. When the man fell, Kennedy continued the assault, kicking him in the ribs until he was dragged away by 3 other men. The violence was excessive, disproportionate, and entirely without remorse. Knowing that the local sheriff would not overlook such a brutal beating, Kennedy packed a meager bundle of clothes that night and walked away from the only home he had ever known, leaving the injured neighbor spitting teeth into the dust. He drifted west, following the currents of the great rivers that served as the arteries of the frontier. He found himself in the rough waterfront districts of St. Louis and Memphis, places where the law was a distant concept and strength was the only currency. He found work as a stevedore, loading massive crates of cargo onto the steamships that churned the muddy waters of the Mississippi. The work was backbreaking, requiring him to hoist cotton bales, barrels of salted pork, and heavy iron machinery for 12 hours a day. The labor kept his muscles hard, but the environment rotted his character. He spent his nights in the riverfront dives, drinking cheap corn whiskey that burned his throat and fueled a sullen, quiet temper. He watched the gamblers and the thieves, observing how easily a man could be separated from his money or his life. He saw bodies pulled from the river, bloated and blue, victims of robberies gone wrong or disputes over cards. He realized that in this transient world, a man could disappear without anyone asking a single question. He began to carry a knife in his boot and a heavy pistol at his waist, tools of the trade for a man who intended to survive at the expense of others. As the political fabric of the nation began to tear in the late 1850s, Kennedy moved toward the bleeding edge of the frontier on the Kansas-Missouri border. The region was engulfed in a guerrilla war between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions, a chaotic conflict that provided cover for every type of criminal activity. Kennedy had no interest in the politics of the war or the rights of men. He cared only for the opportunities the chaos provided. He rode for a time with loose bands of bushwhackers, men who used the cause as an excuse to raid isolated farmsteads and ambush travelers. These raids were exercises in terror. Kennedy participated in the burning of homes and the theft of livestock, watching as families were left destitute on the prairie. He saw men shot down in their own doorways and horses ridden into the ground. The constant exposure to unchecked violence eroded whatever moral inhibitions remained from his childhood. He learned that killing was not a momentous event, but a simple transaction. You pulled the trigger, the obstacle was removed, and you took what you wanted. The sound of gunfire became as common to him as the sound of thunder, and the sight of a corpse was no more moving than a fallen tree. In 1859, the news of gold discoveries in the Rockies swept through the borderlands like a fever. Kennedy, seeing a chance for wealth that did not involve the risks of war, joined the thousands of prospectors pushing west across the Great Plains. He attached himself to a wagon train departing from Independence, a slow-moving column of oxen and canvas venturing into the great American desert. The journey was a grueling test of endurance that stripped away the veneer of civilization from everyone involved. The heat was relentless, baking the ground until it cracked and the dust coated everything in a thick, choking layer of grit. Water was scarce, and the oxen frequently collapsed from exhaustion. Kennedy walked alongside the wagons, his boots wearing thin on the hard earth, his eyes scanning the horizon for threats. He contributed little to the community of the train, hoarding his rations and refusing to help those who fell behind. When a young man from Ohio died of cholera, Kennedy was the first to volunteer to dig the shallow grave, not out of kindness, but to rifle through the dead man's pockets before the earth was shoveled back in. He found $3 and a pocket knife, a small profit for a few minutes of digging. Upon reaching the settlement of Denver City, Kennedy found a scene of utter bedlam. The town was a collection of tents and mud-chinked log cabins huddled at the base of the mountains, populated by desperate men fueled by greed and whiskey. The streets were ankle-deep in filth, and the air rang with the sound of hammers and shouting. Kennedy tried his hand at honest mining in the freezing waters of Clear Creek. He spent weeks standing in the icy current, swirling a metal pan until his hands were numb and blue, searching for the glint of color that would make him rich. The work was agonizing and yielded almost nothing. He watched as other men, lucky or better connected, struck veins of ore and celebrated with champagne in the gambling halls while he ate beans and slept on the ground. The resentment he felt was a physical weight in his gut. He despised the labor, and he despised the men who succeeded where he failed. He began to realize that digging for gold was a fool's game. The intelligent wolf did not hunt the deer. He waited for the other wolves to make the kill and then took it for himself. The turning point that solidified his path as a predator came during the harsh winter of 1860. Kennedy had formed a loose partnership with a German immigrant named Hans, a quiet man who had found a promising placer claim in a remote gulch miles from the nearest camp. They built a crude shelter against a rock face to wait out a blizzard that dumped 4 feet of snow on the mountains in 2 days. Trapped in the tiny freezing space, supplies began to run low. The fire sputtered against the wind, offering little heat, and the 2 men huddled in their blankets, gnawing on strips of frozen jerky. Hans spoke endlessly of his wife back in Europe, of the house he would build, and the gold he was sure lay beneath the snow. Kennedy sat in the corner, his eyes fixed on the back of the German's head, listening to the wind howl outside. The hunger was a sharp pain in his stomach, but the irritation caused by the man's voice was worse. He looked at the meager pile of gold dust they had collected, sitting in a jar on a rock shelf. It wasn't enough for 2 men. It was barely enough for 1. On the 4th morning of the storm, as Hans bent over to lace his boots, Kennedy picked up a heavy piece of firewood. There was no hesitation, no trembling of the hand. He swung the wood with all the strength in his massive shoulder, striking the man at the base of the skull. The sound was a dull thud, sickeningly final. Hans collapsed forward without a cry, his face hitting the dirt floor. Kennedy stood over him, breathing heavily in the thin, cold air. He waited for the guilt, for the fear of God, for any sign of remorse. He felt nothing but a strange, electric clarity. He was alive, and the other man was not. He was the victor. He stripped the body of its coat and boots, took the jar of gold, and dragged the corpse out into the deep snow, pushing it into a ravine where the drifts were 10 feet deep. He returned to the shelter, ate the rest of the food, and slept soundly for the first time in weeks. When he returned to the mining camps after the thaw, he told anyone who asked that the German had given up and walked back to the plains. No one investigated. In the gold rush, men vanished like smoke in the wind. For the next 4 years, Charles Kennedy became a ghost in the Colorado high country. He drifted from camp to camp, never staying long enough to be remembered, always moving before his presence became a problem. He refined his methods, becoming a parasite on the mining industry. He stole horses from corrals in the dead of night, altering their brands with a hot iron before selling them in the next valley. He robbed isolated cabins while the owners were working their claims, taking weapons, food, and clothes. He waylaid lone travelers on the high passes, shooting them from the cover of the rocks and leaving their bodies for the coyotes. He learned to read the land with the eye of a strategist. He saw how the geography funneled movement, how steep cliffs and rushing rivers forced men onto predictable paths. He began to understand that if a man controlled the road, he controlled the people on it. He avoided the large towns like Central City, where the sheriffs were establishing order, sticking to the rugged fringes where the only law was the caliber of a man's rifle. The Civil War raged in the East, and its echoes destabilized the West, drawing away troops and leaving the territories open to lawlessness. Kennedy thrived in this vacuum. He grew a thick, dark beard that hid his face, and his eyes took on a permanent, predatory squint from years of scanning the brush for targets. He was no longer the farm boy from Tennessee. He was a creature of the mountains, hardened by exposure and indifferent to suffering. He developed a taste for the raw, potent whiskey distilled in the mining camps, drinking until his temper was on a hair trigger. Yet he possessed a cunning that kept him from making foolish mistakes. He never fought a fair fight if he could avoid it. He preferred the ambush, the shot from behind, the knife in the dark. He saw honor as a weakness that got men killed. Survival was the only virtue he recognized. By 1864, as the war neared its end and the mining camps became more civilized, Kennedy felt the pressure of the encroaching society. Courts were being established, jails were being built, and vigilance committees were hanging horse thieves from the cottonwood trees. He needed to move on. He needed a place that was still wild, a place where he could operate without looking over his shoulder. He heard rumors of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the south, a formidable range of jagged peaks and deep, isolated valleys in the New Mexico territory. The stories spoke of the Moreno Valley, a high-altitude basin that was virtually uninhabited, a natural thoroughfare for Ute Indians and the occasional hardy traveler moving between Taos and the plains. It was described as a harsh, wind-swept place where winter lasted half the year, a place that killed the weak and hid the strong. Kennedy packed his stolen mule in late September of 1864. He cleaned his rifle, sharpened his skinning knife, and checked the cinches on his saddle. He looked around the crowded mining camp of Buckskin Joe one last time, observing the merchants and the lawyers and the families that were turning the frontier into a copy of the East. He spat into the mud with disdain. He mounted his horse and turned south, riding toward the Spanish peaks that loomed on the horizon. The journey took him through the changing aspen groves, where the leaves were turning to gold, and over the high passes where the first snows were already dusting the rocks. He rode with a singular purpose. He was not looking for gold anymore. He was looking for a location. He sought a specific type of geography, a spot where the trail narrowed, where the weary traveler would have no choice but to stop. He was going to build a spider's web of timber and stone. As he crossed the border into the New Mexico territory, the landscape became more rugged and desolate. The air was thinner, and the silence was profound. Kennedy felt a kinship with this hard country. It demanded strength, and he had plenty of that. He camped under the stars. Eating venison, he shot himself, his mind working on the plans for his future. He would build a rest stop, a sanctuary for those braving the mountain passes. He would offer them a fire, a meal, and a bed. It was a perfect cover. Who would suspect the innkeeper? Who would fear the man offering hospitality in the middle of a blizzard? The idea pleased him. It was a trap that relied on the victim's gratitude. He rode deeper into the mountains, the iron shoes of his horse striking sparks against the granite, moving steadily toward the dark valley that would become his kill box. The man who arrived at the edge of the Moreno Valley was a hollow vessel, stripped of humanity, filled only with a cold, calculating hunger for blood and profit. October 15th, 1865, brought a biting wind down from the high peaks of the Sangre de Cristos, sweeping across the vast empty bowl of the Moreno Valley. Charles Kennedy sat astride his weary horse on a ridge overlooking the basin, the collar of his coat turned up against the chill. Below him, the valley floor stretched out as a sea of yellow grass and dark timber, a deceptive paradise that hid its cruelty behind a veil of scenic beauty. There were no columns of chimney smoke rising from the trees, no sounds of axes ringing against wood, and no tracks of wagons cutting through the frost-stiffened mud. It was a vacuum of civilization, a place where the map was still largely blank, known only to the Ute tribes who hunted the elk herds and the few hardened trappers who passed through on their way to Taos. Kennedy watched the shadows of the clouds race across the valley floor, his breath steaming in the thin air. He was not looking for a view, he was analyzing the arteries of travel. He knew that even in this wilderness, geography dictated movement. Men and horses followed the path of least resistance, and he intended to place himself directly upon that path. He urged his horse down the slope, the animal picking its way carefully through the scree and fallen timber. The descent was steep, the air growing heavier and stiller as they reached the valley floor. Kennedy rode with a slow, deliberate pace, his eyes scanning the terrain for the specific confluence of trails he had heard about in the saloons of Colorado. He needed a spot where the old Indian traces met the rough military road that connected the Rio Grande Valley to the plains. It had to be a choke point, a location where a traveler exhausted from the climb over the pass would naturally look for a place to halt. He rode for hours, the silence of the valley broken only by the crunch of hooves and the wind hissing through the needles of the pine trees. The isolation was absolute. A man, could scream in this valley until his throat bled, and the only answer would be the echo bouncing off the granite walls of Baldy Mountain. By late afternoon he found it. Near the southern end of the valley, the terrain narrowed, funneling the trails together near a small, clear stream that ran cold with snowmelt. The spot was surrounded by a dense thicket of pine and spruce, offering protection from the prevailing winds and, more importantly, concealment from long-range observation. A traveler coming down the pass would not see the site until they were almost upon it. Kennedy dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft earth near the creek bank. He tied his horse to a sapling and walked the perimeter of the clearing. He checked the sight lines, noting how the trees blocked the view from the north and south. He checked the ground, kicking at the dirt to test its depth for digging. It was perfect. It was a natural blind, a place where a spider could sit and wait for the flies to blunder into the web. He did not ask for permission from any government or land office. He simply unrolled his bedroll and claimed the land by right of possession. The construction of the cabin began the next morning at first light. Kennedy possessed a few simple tools, a double-bitted axe, a heavy sledge, a draw knife, and a shovel. But his greatest asset was his immense physical strength. He worked alone, a solitary figure waging war against the forest. He selected the straightest ponderosa pines for the walls, trees that had stood for 100 years before meeting the bite of his axe. The sound of the chopping was a rhythmic, violent percussion that echoed through the empty valley. He felled the trees with precision, dropping them exactly where he needed them to minimize the effort of hauling. Once a tree was down, he stripped the branches, the sharp scent of pine resin filling the air and coating his hands in a sticky amber glaze. He did not peel the bark. He wanted the cabin to blend in with the surrounding woods, to look rough and primitive, a part of the landscape rather than an intrusion upon it. Dragging the logs into position was a brutal task that would have broken a lesser man. Kennedy used his horse to pull the heaviest timbers, chaining them and driving the animal forward with curses and the slap of a rein. But much of the work he did himself. He lifted the ends of the green logs, his muscles straining and the veins in his neck bulging, maneuvering them onto the foundation stones he had dragged from the creek bed. He worked with a grim determination, ignoring the blisters that formed and broke on his palms, ignoring the sweat that froze on his skin the moment he stopped moving. He notched the ends of the logs with the axe, cutting deep saddles so they would lock together tightly. He was not building a temporary shelter, he was building a fortress. The walls rose slowly, tier by tier, a heavy wooden box designed to keep the weather out and the occupants in. As the days turned into weeks, the weather in the valley began to turn. The blue skies of October gave way to the gray, heavy clouds of November. Snow flurries became frequent, dusting the unfinished cabin and making the logs slick and dangerous to handle. Kennedy worked through the storms, driven by the knowledge that the true winter would kill him if he did not have a roof over his head. He constructed the roof frame from lighter poles, lashing them together and covering them with a thick layer of brush and sod dug from the frozen riverbank. It was a low, heavy roof, designed to hold the weight of the massive snowfalls common in the high country. He packed the dirt tight, stomping it down with his boots until it was a solid earthen barrier. Inside, the cabin was dark and cave-like. He cut only a few small windows, just large enough to fire a rifle through, but too small for a man to climb out of easily. He covered these with oiled paper and heavy wooden shutters that could be barred from the inside. The fireplace was the heart of the structure, and Kennedy built it with particular care. He hauled flat stones from the stream, stacking them with a mortar made of clay and water. He built the hearth wide and deep, capable of holding massive logs that would burn through the long, freezing nights. He knew that fire was the primary lure. A traveler freezing on the trail, seeing the glow of a fire through the trees and the smoke rising from the chimney, would be drawn to it instinctively. The promise of warmth was a powerful narcotic, one that dulled a man's caution. Kennedy envisioned the weary prospectors and drifters sitting before this hearth, thawing their frozen hands, completely unaware that the man feeding the fire was sizing them up for the slaughter. He finished the chimney, smoothing the clay with his hands, creating a functional, ugly monument to his intentions. By early December, the cabin was enclosed. Kennedy spent his days chinking the gaps between the logs with a mixture of mud and moss, sealing every crack to prevent the wind from whistling through. He built a heavy door from split planks, reinforcing it with cross braces and hanging it on thick iron hinges he had carried in his saddlebags. He fashioned a sturdy bar that could be dropped into place, securing the door against any intrusion or any escape. The interior of the cabin was divided into two main sections. The front room was the public face, the inn where travelers would eat and sleep. The back room was his private domain, a storage area and sleeping quarter where he could retreat. He built rough bunks along the walls of the front room, filling them with pine boughs and dry grass. It was crude comfort, but to a man who had been sleeping on the ground for weeks, it would look like a palace. The furniture was hewn from the same timber as the walls. He built a heavy table in the center of the room, the surface rough and uneven, scarred by the axe. He constructed benches that were solid and immovable. Everything in the cabin was built with a permanence that suggested he intended to stay forever. There was no fragility here. The floor was initially packed earth, hard and cold, but Kennedy began the process of laying rough planks over it, creating a crawl space underneath that was dark, damp, and accessible only by prying up the boards. He told himself this was for insulation, to keep the cold from seeping up from the ground. But in the back of his mind, the utility of a hidden space beneath the floor was already clear. It was a place to store stolen goods or perhaps things that needed to disappear more permanently. The isolation of the Moreno Valley during that first winter was profound. For weeks at a time, Kennedy saw no other human being. The snow piled up against the walls of the cabin, drifting as high as the windows. The wind howled down from the peaks, shaking the heavy door in its frame and driving snow through the smallest unseen cracks. Kennedy sat by the fire, whittling pegs and cleaning his guns, the silence pressing in on him. A lesser man might have gone mad from the loneliness, but Kennedy thrived in it. He did not need conversation or companionship. He was content with his own thoughts, which revolved around the anticipation of what the spring would bring. He watched the firelight dance on the rough logs, imagining the faces of the men who would sit there in the future. He practiced his hospitality in the empty room, rehearsing the lies he would tell, the friendly demeanor he would adopt. Food was a constant concern. Kennedy hunted the elk and mule deer that wintered in the lower parts of the valley. He tracked them through the deep snow, his breath quiet and controlled, his rifle bringing them down with efficient single shots. He butchered the animals outside the cabin, the blood freezing instantly on the snow, turning it into a grotesque mosaic of red and white. He hung the meat in the cold air to freeze, a natural larder that kept him fed through the lean months. He trapped beaver and marten in the creek, skinning them by the light of the fire, the smell of raw fur and blood becoming the permanent scent of the cabin. He was living the life of a mountain man. But unlike the trappers who sought furs for trade, Kennedy was setting a trap for a different kind of prey. One afternoon in January, a small band of Ute warriors rode past the cabin, their ponies shaggy in their winter coats. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, watching the smoke rise from the chimney. Kennedy stepped out onto the porch, his rifle cradled casually in his arm, his face impassive. He did not wave or call out. He simply stood there, a dark, hulking figure against the timber. The Utes watched him for a long moment, their eyes taking in the heavy construction of the cabin, the defensive nature of the windows, and the cold demeanor of the man. They exchanged words in their own tongue and then rode on, sensing perhaps that this was a place of bad medicine. Kennedy watched them go, satisfied. He wanted to be known as a man who held his ground, a man who was not to be trifled with. As the winter dragged on, Kennedy continued to refine the interior of the trap. He built shelves to hold the whiskey he intended to sell. He knew that alcohol was as important as the fire. A drunk man was a careless man. A drunk man spoke too much, revealing where he kept his money and where he was headed. Kennedy had hauled a small keg of rot-gut spirits with him, and he rationed it carefully, saving it for the business he knew was coming. He tested the acoustics of the cabin, noting how the thick logs dampened sound. A gunshot inside the cabin would be loud, deafening even, but outside, with the wind howling, it would be nothing more than a dull pop, swallowed by the vastness of the valley. This realization pleased him. He could do whatever he wanted within these walls, and the mountains would keep his secret. The ground around the cabin was hard as iron, frozen solid to a depth of several feet. Kennedy attempted to dig a latrine and found the work nearly impossible. He realized that burying anything or anyone during the winter months would be a significant challenge. The earth of the Moreno Valley did not give up its spaces easily. He made a mental note of the ravines and the deep drifts of snow that lingered in the shadows. In the winter, the snow would have to serve as the grave. He walked the property lines he had imagined for himself, learning every rock and stump within a mile of the cabin. He found a spot where the creek formed a deep pool, the water black and slow-moving under the ice. It was another option for disposal. He was methodically cataloging the resources of his kill box. February brought the heaviest snows of the year. The cabin was buried, a white mound with a chimney poking out. Kennedy had to dig a tunnel from his door to the woodshed he had constructed nearby. The world was reduced to the interior of the cabin and the white tunnel. He spent days without seeing the sun. He sat in the dark, conserving his candles, listening to the logs groan under the weight of the snow. He felt a deep, primal connection to the structure. It was an extension of his own body, hard, cold, and impenetrable. He thought about his childhood in Tennessee, about the crowded farmhouse and the constant noise of his family. Here there was only the wind and the beating of his own heart. He had created a kingdom of one. As March arrived, the sun began to gain strength. The snow on the south-facing slopes began to melt, revealing the brown, matted grass underneath. The creek swelled with runoff, the ice breaking up with loud cracks that sounded like rifle shots. Kennedy sensed the change in the season. The pass would soon be open. The travelers would begin to move. He cleaned the cabin thoroughly, sweeping the dirt floor, scrubbing the table, and airing out the bedding. He wanted the place to smell welcoming, not like the den of a hibernating animal. He shaved his beard down to a manageable length, trying to look more like a settler and less like a savage. He checked his supplies, counting the rounds of ammunition and the strips of dried meat. He was ready. He positioned himself on the porch during the warmer afternoons, whittling on a stick, his eyes fixed on the trail coming down from the pass. He was a spider waiting for the vibration of the web. He felt a tightening in his chest, not of fear but of anticipation. He wondered who the first one would be. Would it be a prospector with a pouch full of dust, a soldier deserting his post, a cowboy riding north? It didn't matter. They were all the same to him. They were resources to be harvested. He rehearsed the greeting in his mind. "Step down, stranger. Coffee's hot, fire's warm." Simple words, innocent words, the keys that would unlock the door to their destruction. The environment of the Moreno Valley had accepted the cabin. The local wildlife had grown used to the structure. Jays hopped on the roof and squirrels ran along the porch rail. To the casual observer, it was a peaceful scene, a pioneer homestead in a beautiful, rugged valley. But the beauty was a mask. The cabin was the anomaly in the natural order, a place built for unnatural ends. Kennedy had poured his malice into the very logs. The structure stood as a physical manifestation of his darkening soul. It was a place where the laws of man would not apply, where the only rule was the rule of the strongest. By late March, the first trickle of traffic began. A group of freighters passed by, their wagons heavy with supplies for the settlements to the south. They waved at Kennedy and he waved back, a stoic guardian of the trail. They did not stop. They were well provisioned and moving in a group. Kennedy watched them with a patient stare. He was not interested in groups, not yet. He was waiting for the solitary traveler, the stray from the herd. He knew that the vast distances of the West created many such strays. Men who argued with their partners, men who were running from the law, men who simply preferred the quiet of the trail. These were his targets. The nights remained freezing cold, ensuring that anyone caught on the trail after dark would be desperate for shelter. Kennedy kept the fire roaring every night, a beacon in the black void of the valley. He would stand outside and look at the chimney sparks flying up into the stars, visualizing the trap snapping shut. He had claimed the pass of death not by naming it but by inhabiting it. He had inserted himself into the geography of the territory like a tumor. The cabin was finished, the stage was set, the actor was in place. All that was missing was the audience. As April 1866 approached, the winds shifted, bringing the scent of rain and wet earth. The valley was waking up. The bears were emerging from their dens, hungry and irritable. The elk were moving back up to the high pastures. And Charles Kennedy sat on his porch, a loaded pistol tucked into his belt beneath his coat, his eyes cold and empty, watching the empty trail with the patience of a geological force. He was the most dangerous thing in the valley, and soon the world would know it. April 14, 1866 arrived with a wet, heavy grayness that blanketed the Moreno Valley, signaling the reluctant retreat of winter. The snow that had choked the passes for months was receding, transforming the valley floor into a treacherous expanse of mud and slush. Charles Kennedy stood on the porch of his newly completed cabin, watching the rain drip from the eaves. The structure behind him was no longer just a pile of logs. It was a fully functioning way station, stocked with firewood, whiskey, and a grim patience. The silence of the winter isolation was beginning to break. The sounds of the forest were returning, the croak of ravens, the rush of the swollen creek, and the wind sighing through the wet pine needles. Kennedy leaned against the doorframe, his thumbs hooked into his belt, his eyes fixed on the northern trail. He had spent the long, dark months rehearsing this moment in his mind, and now the curtain was rising. The trap was set, the bait was laid, and the predator was hungry. The afternoon wore on, the light fading into a bruised purple behind the western peaks. Just as Kennedy was turning to go back inside, he saw movement at the edge of the tree line. A solitary figure emerged from the shadows of the forest, walking beside a mule that looked as exhausted as its master. The traveler was a man of average height, hunched forward against the drizzle, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He moved with the slow, plodding gait of someone who had been walking for days without a proper meal or a dry place to sleep. Kennedy felt a surge of adrenaline, a cold electric current that started in his gut and radiated out to his fingertips. He did not reach for a weapon. He composed his face. He smoothed the rough edges of his demeanor, forcing his mouth into a semblance of a welcoming smile. This was the performance he had practiced in the mirror of the frozen creek. The traveler approached the cabin with cautious hope. He saw the smoke curling from the chimney, a gray ribbon promising warmth. He saw the sturdy walls and the dry porch. When he looked up and saw Kennedy standing there, he paused, his hand drifting instinctively toward the knife at his belt. Kennedy raised a hand in a gesture of peace, stepping out into the rain to meet the man. He spoke first, his voice low and rumbling, pitched to sound like the greeting of a fellow pioneer rather than a threat. He offered the stranger a place to dry off and a hot meal, mentioning that the coffee was already boiling. The traveler hesitated for a second, scanning Kennedy's face for treachery, but the cold and the fatigue weighed heavier than his suspicion. He nodded, thanked Kennedy, and tied his mule to the rail. Kennedy watched the man unpack his saddlebags. He noted the heavy canvas coat, the well-worn boots, and the shape of a revolver under the man's jacket. He did not offer to help with the gear. He simply held the door open, ushering the guest into the kill box. The transition from the exterior world to the interior of the cabin was jarring. Outside, it was wet, cold, and hostile. Inside, the fire roared in the hearth, casting a golden, flickering light over the rough-hewn furniture. The air smelled of wood smoke, old tobacco, and the venison stew bubbling in a pot on the hook. To the traveler, it must have seemed like a sanctuary. He stripped off his wet coat, shivering as the warmth hit his skin, and moved toward the fire, rubbing his hands together. Kennedy moved behind the bar he had constructed, pouring a tin cup of whiskey and sliding it across the wood. The man's name was Patrick, a drifter from the Pennsylvania coal fields who had come west looking for silver and found only blisters and debt. He drank the whiskey in one swallow, the liquid burning away the chill of the trail. As the alcohol hit his empty stomach, his tongue loosened. He began to talk, filling the silence of the cabin with the sound of his own voice. He spoke of the harsh crossing of the plains, of the dishonesty of the merchants in Denver, and of his plans to head south to Santa Fe, where he heard there was work for a man who knew how to handle explosives. Kennedy listened, or appeared to listen, nodding at the appropriate intervals and refilling the cup. In reality, he was conducting an inventory. He was assessing the weight of the man's coin purse when he set it on the table. He was noting the quality of the man's rifle leaning against the wall. He was calculating the value of the mule outside. As the evening deepened, the wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters and making the fire flare. Kennedy ladled a bowl of stew for his guest, placing it on the table along with a chunk of hard bread. Patrick ate with the voracious hunger of a starving animal, wiping the bowl clean with the bread and asking for seconds. Kennedy obliged, playing the role of the generous host to perfection. He ate his own meal slowly, his eyes never leaving the man's face. He watched the way the traveler relaxed, how his shoulders dropped, how his guard lowered with every mouthful of food and every drop of whiskey. The tension that had been present when Patrick first walked in had evaporated, replaced by a drowsy contentment. The man felt safe. He believed he had found a friend in the wilderness. Kennedy cleared the plates, moving with a quiet efficiency. He felt a profound contempt for the man sitting at his table. Patrick was weak. He was trusting. He had walked into a stranger's house in the middle of nowhere and exposed his throat. In Kennedy's mind, this lack of survival instinct was a capital offense. The world was a place of wolves and sheep, and Patrick had just proven which category he belonged to. Kennedy went back to the bar and poured himself a small measure of whiskey, sipping it as he leaned against the logs. He asked Patrick about his family, a question designed to gauge if anyone would come looking for him. Patrick shook his head, admitting he had no wife or children, only a brother back east he hadn't spoken to in 10 years. Kennedy filed this information away. It was the final tumblers of the lock clicking into place. The fire burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Patrick yawned, stretching his arms over his head. He mumbled something about needing to turn in, asking if he could spread his bedroll in the corner. Kennedy nodded, gesturing to the bunk he had built against the far wall. He told the man to sleep there, that it was more comfortable than the floor. Patrick thanked him again, his speech slurred from the drink. He stood up, swaying slightly, and began to unbuckle his gun belt, draping it over the back of the chair. He turned his back to Kennedy to arrange the blankets on the bunk. Kennedy moved. He did not rush. He moved with the fluid, heavy momentum of a falling tree. He reached behind the bar and retrieved a heavy piece of hickory firewood he had set aside for this specific purpose. He stepped across the room, his boots silent on the earth-packed floor. Patrick was bending over the bunk, fluffing the straw mattress. He never saw the blow coming. Kennedy swung the wood with a short chopping motion, driving it into the base of the skull. The sound was a dull, wet thud, sickeningly distinct in the quiet room. Patrick's knees buckled instantly. He dropped forward onto the bunk, his face burying into the blankets he had just smoothed out. He did not cry out. He made a low gurgling sound as the air left his lungs, and then he was still. Kennedy stood over the body, his chest heaving slightly, the piece of wood still gripped in his hand. He waited. He listened to the wind outside. He listened for any sign of movement from the man on the bunk. There was nothing. The violence had been absolute. He felt a strange sensation wash over him, not guilt, not horror, but a rush of power so intense it was almost sexual. He had extinguished a life. He had taken a breathing, thinking human being and turned him into an object. The total control he had sought since childhood was now his. He placed the wood on the table and rolled the body over. Patrick's eyes were half open, staring blankly at the ceiling, a trickle of blood running from his nose. Kennedy looked into the dead eyes and felt nothing but a cold satisfaction. The practicalities of the situation asserted themselves immediately. He had a corpse in his dining room. He stripped the body quickly and efficiently, removing the boots, the coat, the trousers, and the flannel shirt. He checked the pockets, finding a few dollars in silver and a crumpled letter from a woman in Ohio. He tossed the clothes into a pile to be sorted later. The body looked small and pale in the firelight, stripped of its dignity. Kennedy lifted the dead man, surprised by the dead weight. A man was much heavier when the life was gone from him. He hoisted the body over his shoulder, the limbs dangling, awkwardly, and carried it to the back door. He kicked the door open and stepped out into the night. The rain had turned to a cold mist. Kennedy walked through the mud to the edge of the clearing where the ground dropped away into a steep ravine choked with brush. He had scouted this spot months ago. He swung the body and heaved it over the edge. It tumbled down the slope, crashing through the scrub oak and coming to rest in the darkness at the bottom. Kennedy stood there for a moment, listening. He could hear the creek rushing below. He knew the coyotes and the bears would find the body within a day or two. The wilderness was an efficient disposal system. He turned and walked back to the cabin, wiping his hands on his trousers. Back inside, he went to work erasing the evidence. He scrubbed the small amount of blood from the floor with a stiff brush and a bucket of water. He took the man's gun belt and rifle and hid them in the crawl space beneath the floorboards, prying up the planks he had loosened earlier. He took the saddlebags and emptied them, sorting the contents on the table. There was a razor, a comb, a spare shirt, and a bag of tobacco. Kennedy took the tobacco and filled his pipe, lighting it with a twig from the fire. He sat in the chair where Patrick had sat only an hour before, smoking the dead man's tobacco, staring into the dying fire. He felt a sense of ownership. Everything the man had possessed was now his. The mule outside, the silver in his pocket, the clothes on the floor, it was all profit. The murder transformed the cabin. It was no longer just a building, it was an accomplice. The walls had witnessed the act and remained silent. The floor had absorbed the blood. Kennedy looked around the room with new eyes. He saw the potential for a system. One man was easy. 2 men would be harder but possible. He realized he needed to refine his methods. The club was effective but messy. A gunshot would be cleaner but louder. He weighed the risks. The isolation was his greatest ally. He could do whatever he wanted here. He poured himself another drink, toasting the empty room. The next morning, Kennedy woke early. The sun was breaking through the clouds, illuminating the valley with a crisp, clear light. He went outside to deal with the mule. He led the animal away from the cabin, taking it deep into the woods to a small corral he had built out of sight of the trail. He would keep it there for a few weeks until the brand could be altered or the animal sold to a passing trader who wouldn't ask questions. He returned to the cabin and burned the letter he had found in Patrick's pocket. He watched the paper curl and blacken in the flames, the last connection to the man's identity turning to ash. As far as the world was concerned, Patrick had simply walked off the map. In the days that followed, Kennedy felt a restless energy. The crossing of the line had changed him. The hesitation was gone. He found himself scanning the trail constantly, eager for the next opportunity. He began to improve the trap. He moved the table slightly so that a guest's back would be more fully exposed to the room. He oiled the hinges on the door so they would not squeak. He sharpened his knife until it could shave the hair off his arm. He was optimizing his workspace. He was professionalizing the act of murder. 2 weeks later, another traveler appeared. This one was a young man, barely 20, riding a lame horse. He looked frightened and lost. Kennedy greeted him with the same warm smile, the same offer of coffee. The routine was identical. The man came in, ate the stew, drank the whiskey. But this time, Kennedy felt no surge of adrenaline. He felt only a calm, mechanical precision. When the moment came, he used the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. The result was the same. The body went into the ravine. The horse was turned loose to run wild. The clothes were added to the pile. Kennedy began to understand the economics of his operation. The victims were not people. They were supply crates. Some contained gold, some contained weapons, some contained only dirty laundry. You cracked them open to see what was inside. He stopped thinking of them as guests and started thinking of them as yield. He developed a system for the loot. Cash was kept in a tin box under his bunk. Weapons were cleaned and stored for sale. Clothes were washed and folded. He was running a business, and the business was death. The weather in May warmed considerably. The mud dried into hard ruts. The wildflowers began to bloom in the meadows, painting the valley in shades of purple and yellow. The beauty of the landscape stood in stark contrast to the horror unfolding inside the cabin. Kennedy lived in a dichotomy. By day, he was the helpful station master, chopping wood and waving to the freight wagons that passed. By night, he was a monster. He learned to separate the two existences perfectly. He could murder a man at midnight and sell a cup of coffee to a soldier at dawn without blinking. He discovered that the ravine was filling up. The scavengers were doing their work, but the bones remained. He realized he would need a better solution for the summer months when the smell might travel. He began to scout for a burial ground. He found a spot behind the cabin where the soil was sandy and easy to dig. He started digging graves in advance, covering them with brush so they would be ready when needed. He was planning ahead. He was anticipating volume. The psychological callus that had begun to form in Tennessee was now thick and impenetrable. Kennedy had lost the ability to empathize completely. He viewed the fear in a victim's eyes with the same indifference he viewed a beetle crawling on the table. He was the apex predator of the Moreno Valley. He controlled who lived and who died. This power was intoxicating. It made him feel like a god in his own small, bloody universe. One evening, a group of 3 prospectors stopped at the cabin. Kennedy assessed them quickly. 3 was too many. They were armed and alert. He shifted gears instantly. He became the perfect host. He fed them, told them stories about the trail ahead, and sold them a bottle of whiskey for 3 times its value. He let them sleep on the floor and sent them on their way the next morning with a wave. He was not a berserker. He was a calculator. He knew when to strike and when to wait. This discipline was what made him truly dangerous. He was not driven by a chaotic bloodlust, but by a cold, rational greed. As the spring turned toward summer, the traffic on the trail increased. The Civil War was over and the nation was moving west. Men were looking for new starts, new land, new gold. They flowed into the territory like a tide. Kennedy watched them come. He saw the hope in their faces, the determination in their posture. He saw their vulnerability. He sat on his porch, whittling a piece of pine, the pile of shavings growing at his feet. He was the toll collector on the road to paradise, and the price of passage was everything they had. He began to experiment with the disposal of the bodies. He found that if he dismembered them, they were easier to bury and easier for the animals to scatter. He performed this grisly work in the woodshed by the light of a lantern. He approached it with the same workmanlike attitude he applied to skinning a deer. It was just meat and bone. He washed the blood from his hands in the creek, the cold water numbing his skin. He slept soundly every night, his conscience silent, his dreams untroubled. By the end of June, the cabin had claimed 5 lives. 5 men who had vanished into the thin air of the Rockies. Their families would wait for letters that never came. Their friends would wonder what became of them. But in the Moreno Valley, the only record of their passing was the growing pile of goods under the floorboards and the loose earth in the woods behind the cabin. Charles Kennedy had successfully transformed his home into a slaughterhouse. He had tested his methods, refined his techniques, and proven to himself that he could kill with impunity. The first traveler, Patrick, was just a memory now, a vague face in a growing gallery of ghosts. But his death had been the keystone. It had proven that the plan worked. It had proven that a man could vanish without a ripple. Kennedy looked out at the valley, green and lush under the summer sun. He felt a deep sense of accomplishment. He had built something here. He had built a machine that turned life into money. And he was just getting started. The rush was coming, he could feel it. And when it arrived, he would be ready. The spider was in the center of the web and the flies were buzzing on the horizon. The spring of 1867 shattered the prehistoric silence of the Moreno Valley with a shout that echoed from the slopes of Baldy Mountain to the grassy basin below. The discovery of placer gold in the creek beds and rich veins of quartz in the high rock transformed the geography of the Sangre de Cristos from a desolate wilderness into a frenetic hive of human ambition almost overnight. Charles Kennedy stood on the porch of his cabin watching the transformation with the heavy-lidded gaze of a crocodile submerged in a river crossing. The solitary trail that had once seen only the occasional drift of a trapper or a Ute hunting party was now a scarred artery of commerce, churned into a morass of mud and ruts by the wheels of 1,000 wagons. The air, previously crisp and clean, now carried the permanent haze of campfire smoke and the dust kicked up by the endless procession of boots, hooves, and iron-rimmed wheels. The influx of humanity was a tide that brought every variety of man to Kennedy's doorstep. There were the greenhorns from the east, men with soft hands and expensive gear who looked at the mountains with romantic awe, unaware that the elevation could kill them as surely as a bullet. There were the veterans of the California and Colorado rushes, hard men with leathery skin and eyes that constantly scanned for claim jumpers. There were merchants, gamblers, whores, and thieves, all drawn by the magnetic pull of the yellow metal. Kennedy did not share their fever for digging in the dirt. He understood that the gold fever made men blind. It made them careless. It focused their attention so completely on the potential for wealth that they forgot to watch the shadows. For a predator like Kennedy, the gold rush was not a competition. It was a buffet. His cabin, situated perfectly at the choke point of the southern entrance to the valley, became an unavoidable landmark. The sheer volume of traffic forced him to adapt his methods. He could no longer simply kill everyone who passed. The numbers were too high and the risk of discovery was too great. He had to become selective. He had to become a filter. He spent his days leaning against the rough timber of his door frame, whittling his endless pile of shavings, nodding to the passing columns of prospectors. He presented himself as the surly but necessary station master, a fixture of the trail who offered nothing more than bad coffee and a dry floor. This visibility was his best camouflage. In the chaos of the boom, no one suspected the man who watched them all pass. The interior of the cabin became a theater of assessment. Kennedy welcomed travelers in, his eyes quickly cataloging their possessions. He looked for the weight of a saddlebag, the quality of a rifle, the jingle of coin in a pocket. He learned to distinguish between the men arriving with hope and money and the men leaving with gold and exhaustion. The latter were the prize. A miner returning to Taos or Santa Fe after a successful season was a walking bank vault, usually tired, often drunk, and always eager for a final rest before hitting the civilization of the Rio Grande Valley. Kennedy offered them that rest. He poured the whiskey with a heavy hand, ensuring that their senses were dulled long before they laid their heads down. One evening in late June, two brothers from Texas stopped at the cabin. They were loud, brash men who had struck a small pocket of gold in Willow Creek and were heading south to spend it on women and cards. They threw their bags onto the table with a heavy thud that told Kennedy everything he needed to know. The sound of gold dust in leather pouches was distinct. It was a dull, dense impact that did not bounce. Kennedy served them stew, listening to their boasting with a polite nod. He encouraged them to drink, opening a fresh bottle of the rotgut he kept for such occasions. The brothers drank until they were slurring their words, clapping Kennedy on the shoulder and calling him a good host. They never saw the contempt behind his eyes. To him, they were already dead. They were simply waiting for their bodies to catch up to the reality. When the brothers finally passed out, one slumped over the table and the other snoring on the floor, Kennedy went to work. He did not use a firearm. The noise was a risk with so many people on the trail. He used the heavy iron felling axe he kept by the hearth. He moved with a terrifying economy of motion. He struck the brother on the table first, the blade severing the spine at the base of the neck. The man died without lifting his head. The second brother stirred at the sound, blinking his eyes open just in time to see the shadow of the axe descending. It was brutal, bloody work, far removed from the clean kills of a marksman. The cabin floor became slick with gore, the smell of copper mixing with the stale whiskey. Kennedy did not pause to retch or tremble. He dragged the bodies to the back door, his boots sliding in the mess, and dumped them into the darkness. The looting was the harvest. Kennedy emptied the leather pouches onto the table, the gold dust shimmering in the firelight. It was a pile of raw wealth that represented months of backbreaking labor for the Texans, transferred to Kennedy in a matter of seconds. He poured the dust into glass jars, sealing them tight and burying them in the hole he had dug beneath the floorboards of his bedroom. He burned their clothes in the fireplace, the wool and cotton turning to black ash that floated up the chimney. He took their horses miles down the valley in the dark, turning them loose to join the wild herds that roamed the foothills. By dawn, the cabin was scrubbed clean, the floor covered in fresh sawdust, and Kennedy was brewing coffee, ready to greet the first wagons of the day. As the summer of 1867 heated up, the town of Elizabethtown exploded into existence a few miles to the north. It was a raw, ugly settlement of tents and log, shacks that grew faster than the law could follow. Saloons, dance halls, and gambling dens operated 24 hours a day, fueled by the gold coming out of the ground. The violence in E-Town was commonplace. Shootings and knifings over claim disputes were daily occurrences. This ambient violence worked in Kennedy's favor. If a man went missing, it was assumed he had been killed in a brawl or fallen down a mine shaft or simply moved on to the next strike. The transient nature of the population meant that no one stayed long enough to notice patterns. A face seen one day was gone the next, and nobody asked why. Kennedy ventured into Elizabethtown only when necessary, usually to buy supplies or to trade the smaller items he had taken from his victims. He walked the muddy streets as a ghost, a large, silent man who spoke only to conduct business. He observed the frenzied energy of the town with disdain. These men were slaves to their greed, frantically digging and washing the earth, while he simply waited for them to bring the product to him. He purchased barrels of flour, sacks of coffee, and cases of whiskey, paying with the silver coins he had taken from the pockets of the dead. He was funding his operation with the assets of his victims, a closed loop of predation that cost him nothing but his labor. The problem of body disposal became acute as the summer wore on. The ravine he had used initially was becoming too full, and the warm weather brought the risk of decomposition smells drifting up to the trail. Kennedy began to dig graves in the dense thicket behind the cabin, working at night by the light of a shuttered lantern. The ground was rocky and filled with roots, making the digging arduous. He stripped the bodies naked to speed up the decay, tossing the limbs and torsos into the shallow pits and covering them with lime he had stolen from a mining supply wagon, followed by rocks and earth. He scattered pine needles and leaves over the fresh graves to blend them with the forest floor. The area behind his home was becoming a secret cemetery, a crowded plot of anonymous bones. In August, a solitary prospector named Miller stopped at the cabin. He was an older man, cautious and quiet, who had been working a claim high on Baldy Mountain. He carried a heavy pack and a rifle that he never let out of his reach. Miller did not drink, and he sat with his back to the wall, watching Kennedy with suspicious eyes. Kennedy recognized the danger. This was not a fool, this was a man who knew the risks of the trail. Kennedy played the long game. He did not make a move that first night. He let Miller sleep in the corner, keeping his own distance. In the morning, he offered Miller a breakfast of bacon and eggs, refusing payment. He chatted about the trail conditions, warning Miller of a washout miles to the south. Miller relaxed, his suspicion eroded by the mundane hospitality. He lowered his guard, believing that if Kennedy intended to kill him, he would have done it during the night. As Miller packed his gear to leave, turning his back to tighten a strap on his pack, Kennedy struck. He used a heavy length of stove wood, swinging it with a force that crushed the man's skull. Miller crumpled without a sound. It was a lesson in patience. Kennedy had waited 12 hours for a 2-second opening. He searched the pack and found a heavy bag of nuggets, the result of a lucky strike that Miller had guarded with his life, only to lose it at the finish line. The constant killing began to have a numbing effect on Kennedy's psyche. He no longer felt the rush of power he had experienced with the first murders. It had become manual labor, a necessary chore like chopping wood or hauling water. The value of human life had been completely erased from his mind. A man was nothing more than a container to be opened. He ate his meals at the same table where he had slaughtered a dozen men, sleeping in the room next to where he stored their remains. The illicit smell of blood and death was always faint in the air, masked by the wood smoke and the tobacco. But it was there. It soaked into the pores of the wood. It stained the cracks in the floor. As autumn approached, the weather began to turn. The aspen trees on the slopes turned a brilliant gold, mirroring the wealth that was being pulled from the earth. The nights grew cold and the traffic on the trail shifted. The flow was now predominantly southward as men fled the high country before the snows trapped them. This was the harvest season for Kennedy. The miners were leaving with their season's take. He worked with a feverish intensity, claiming a victim every week. The crawl space beneath the floor was filled with saddles, tools, and weapons. The jars of gold dust were multiplying. He was becoming a wealthy man, but he could not spend the wealth. To flash gold in E-Town would raise questions. He was a miser guarding a hoard of blood money. One rainy night in October, a freighter's wagon broke a wheel axle just outside the cabin. The driver, a man named Henderson, came to the door soaking wet, asking for help. Kennedy went out into the mud, assessing the situation. The wagon was loaded with mining equipment and crates of dry goods. There was no gold, but the cargo was valuable. Kennedy helped the man fix the axle, using his immense strength to lift the wagon corner while Henderson slid a log underneath. He could have killed Henderson right there in the rain. It would have been easy, but Kennedy calculated the risk. A missing wagon was harder to hide than a missing man. A wagon left a trail. It was large, distinctive. Kennedy chose to let Henderson live. He shared a drink with the man, accepted a few dollars for his help, and sent him on his way. It was a calculated decision. By helping the freighter, he solidified his reputation as a good Samaritan. Henderson would go to Santa Fe and tell people that Charles Kennedy was a rough man, but helpful in a pinch. This cover was essential. It provided the shield of respectability that allowed the murders to continue. Kennedy understood that to be a successful monster, one had to occasionally wear the mask of a saint. By November 1867, the snows began to fall in earnest, slowing the traffic to a trickle. The frantic energy of the gold rush hibernated for the winter. The valley returned to a semblance of its former quiet, but the silence was different now. It was the silence of a graveyard. Kennedy sat by his fire, surrounded by the spoils of his war on humanity. He had survived the boom. He had profited from the chaos. He had turned the collective madness of the gold rush into his personal fortune. The isolation of the coming winter weighed on his mind, but for different reasons than before. He had money, he had a secure location, but the sheer logistics of the operation were becoming difficult for one man to manage. The cleaning, the cooking, the disposal, the watching, it was a relentless grind. He began to think about the need for help. Not a partner in crime, for a partner would want a share of the gold and could betray him. He needed a servant. He needed someone he could control completely, someone bound to him by fear and law, who could handle the domestic drudgery while he focused on the business of killing. He thought of the Ute women he had seen in the camps near Taos. He thought of the Mexican women in the villages to the south. He needed a wife, not for love and certainly not for companionship. He needed a wife in the same way he needed a mule or a new axe. He needed a tool to maintain the infrastructure of the kill box. As the wind howled around the corners of the cabin, piling the snow against the logs, Charles Kennedy made a decision. When the pass opened in the spring, he would not just hunt for gold, he would hunt for a housekeeper. The year of 1867 ended with Kennedy sitting on a fortune of stolen dust and a foundation of bones. The gold rush had changed the West, bringing civilization to the wilderness. But in the dark corner of the Moreno Valley, it had only fed the darkness. The cabin stood as a monument to the shadow side of the American dream, a place where the pursuit of wealth ended in a shallow grave. The man inside stroked his beard, listening to the fire crackle, his mind already planning the expansions for the next season. The gold was good, but the blood was easier. Winter of 1868 descended upon the Moreno Valley with a ferocity that buried the landscape under feet of drifting snow, sealing the pass and isolating the inhabitants of the high country in a world of white silence. Inside the heavy log walls of Charles Kennedy's cabin, the atmosphere was thick with a tension far more dangerous than the storms raging outside. The solitude that Kennedy had once cherished was gone, replaced by a domestic arrangement that was not born of love or courtship, but of necessity and domination. Gregoria Cortez, a young woman from the Mora area, now moved through the dim interior of the roadhouse, a silent figure in a long calico skirt and a heavy shawl. She was not a partner in this enterprise. She was a prisoner in a cage built of pine and terror. Kennedy had acquired her with the same transactional coldness he used to buy a horse or a gun, exploiting her vulnerability and the chaotic social structures of the frontier to claim her as his property. He needed a cook, a cleaner, and a bed warmer, and in Gregoria he found a vessel for his cruelty that would not fight back. The dynamic within the cabin was defined by absolute control. Kennedy sat by the fire, his massive frame occupying the best chair, whittling his sticks and watching her with a gaze that was both possessive and threatening. Gregoria learned the rules of her new existence quickly, for the penalties for infraction were swift and brutal. She learned to move without making a sound, to keep the coffee pot full at all times and to avert her eyes when he looked at her. Her world had shrunk to the four walls of the main room and the small, freezing lean-to kitchen where she spent her days scrubbing pots and preparing meals for the men her husband intended to murder. She was a witness to the machinery of death, forced to live inside the engine room, breathing the air that smelled of stale tobacco, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of blood that never seemed to fully leave the floorboards. The first time she witnessed the violence, it shattered whatever fragile hope she had held that this man was merely rough and not a monster. A traveler had arrived just as the snow began to fall, a young man with a hopeful face and a pack full of mining tools. Kennedy had played the host, his voice booming with false conviviality, while Gregoria served the stew, her hands trembling so hard she nearly dropped the ladle. She wanted to scream, to warn the stranger that the man pouring his whiskey was a devil, but Kennedy's eyes were on her, promising a punishment worse than death if she uttered a syllable. She retreated to the shadows of the kitchen, clutching her rosary, listening to the murmur of conversation drift into the silence of the night. She heard the scrape of the chair, the heavy thud of the wood striking bone, and the sudden, sickening silence that followed. There was no struggle, no fight, just the extinguishing of a life. Kennedy called for her moments later. She walked into the main room to find the stranger slumped over the table, his blood dripping onto the wood she had polished that morning. Kennedy did not look at the body. He looked at her, pointing to a bucket and a rag. He ordered her to clean it up. This was her initiation. She was no longer just an observer. She was now an accessory. With tears streaming down her face, she knelt on the hard planks and scrubbed the lifeblood of an innocent man from the grain of the wood. Kennedy watched her, smoking his pipe, deriving a sick satisfaction from her degradation. He was breaking her to the yoke, showing her that her hands were now as dirty as his. From that night on, the cabin became a place of ghosts for her, every corner holding the memory of a dead man. The isolation of that winter was absolute. The snow piled up against the windows, blocking out the light and turning the cabin into a dark subterranean lair. There was no one to run to. The nearest settlement was Elizabethtown, miles away through impassable drifts. And even if she could reach it, who would believe the Indian wife of a respected station master? The racial dynamics of the territory worked in Kennedy's favor. His word was law, and hers was wind. She was trapped by the geography and the prejudice of the time. She spent hours staring into the fire, listening to the wind howl, feeling the weight of the entrapment crushing her spirit. Kennedy controlled the food, the firewood, and the door. He was the warden, and she was the inmate serving a life sentence. The horror of her situation was compounded by the presence of their infant son. The child had been born into this house of slaughter, a small, innocent life existing in the center of a kill box. Gregoria fiercely protected the boy, keeping him swaddled close to her body, trying to shield his eyes and ears from the reality of his father. The baby's cries were the only sound of defiance in the cabin, piercing the heavy silence that Kennedy preferred. Kennedy viewed the child with a strange mixture of indifference and ownership. He did not coo or play with the boy. He looked at him as one looks at a future asset, another set of hands to eventually help with the work. For Gregoria, the child was both her anchor and her greatest vulnerability. She could not run and risk the baby freezing in the snow, and she could not fight and risk Kennedy turning his rage upon the boy. The child was the chain that bound her to the hearth. As the winter dragged on, the cabin became a pressure cooker of psychological torture. Kennedy's drinking increased during the long nights when the trail was empty. He would consume an entire bottle of raw whiskey, his mood darkening with every drop. These were the nights Gregoria feared the most. The violence that he usually reserved for travelers would turn inward. He would rage at her for the fire being too low, for the food being too cold, or simply for existing. The blows were heavy and open-handed, designed to bruise and cow rather than to kill. He needed her alive to work, but he wanted her broken. She learned to endure the pain in silence, curling her body around the child to take the brunt of his drunken fury. The next morning he would act as if nothing had happened, demanding his breakfast with the calm entitlement of a king. The domestic routine of the Kennedy household was a grotesque parody of frontier life. To an outsider stopping for a meal, it looked like a hard but normal existence. The wife cooked, the husband chopped wood, the baby slept in a cradle by the fire. But beneath the surface, everything was rot. Gregoria cooked meals using the supplies stolen from the dead. She wore shawls and dresses taken from the trunks of murdered travelers. She swept the floor over the spot where men had died. The deception required a constant, exhausting vigilance. She had to smile when guests arrived, had to pour their coffee with a steady hand, knowing that the man sitting across from her would likely be a corpse by morning. The guilt was a physical weight, a stone in her stomach that never went away. She felt that every mouthful of food she ate was stolen from the mouth of a ghost. One evening in February, a trapper named Pierre stopped at the cabin, driven in by a blizzard. He was a jovial man who spoke a mix of French and English, making the baby smile with a game of peekaboo. Gregoria felt a desperate, clawing urge to save him. When Kennedy went to the woodshed to fetch more fuel, she caught Pierre's eye and tried to signal him, widening her eyes and shaking her head slightly, gesturing toward the door. The trapper misunderstood, thinking she was merely nervous or shy, and offered her a reassuring smile. The moment passed, and the opportunity died. When Kennedy returned, he sensed the tension in the room, his eyes darting between his wife and the guest. He said nothing, but the look he gave Gregoria froze the blood in her veins. Pierre died 3 hours later, a hatchet blow ending his laughter forever. That night, Kennedy beat Gregoria until she could barely stand, a silent lesson on the consequences of betrayal. The cellar beneath the floorboards became the repository of the nightmare. Gregoria knew it was there, knew that Kennedy spent hours down in the damp darkness, organizing the loot and hiding the evidence. She could hear him moving boxes, the clink of glass jars filled with gold dust, the rustle of stolen fabrics. It was a dragon's hoard of misery. Occasionally he would bring up an item for her to use, a silver comb, a fine wool blanket, a mirror. He would present these things to her not as gifts, but as tests. If she refused them, he would become angry. If she accepted them, she felt complicit. She was forced to adorn herself in the plunder of the grave, wearing the jewelry of widows she would never meet. It was a psychological branding, marking her as part of his tribe, separate from the rest of humanity. The smell of the cabin was something she could never scrub away. It was a mix of wood smoke, grease, unwashed wool, and the faint copper scent of old blood. In the summer, when the heat rose, the smell seemed to seep out of the cracks in the floor. Gregoria would burn sage and pine needles, trying to mask the odor, but it lingered in her nose, a permanent olfactory reminder of where she lived. She worried constantly that the guests would smell it, that they would wrinkle their noses and ask what had died. But the scent of the venison stew and the tobacco usually covered it enough to fool the unsuspecting. To Gregoria, however, the house smelled of death. It was in the bedding, in the curtains, in the very timber of the walls. Spring brought the mud and the return of the travelers, but it brought no relief for Gregoria. The thawing ground meant that Kennedy resumed his work in the garden of bones behind the cabin. He forced her to help him carry the heavier bodies, threatening to kill the child if she refused. They would drag the stiff, frozen corpses out into the night, slipping in the slush, the dead heels dragging lines in the mud. She had to hold the lantern while he dug, the pale light illuminating the grisly work. She saw the faces of the men she had served coffee to, now gray and slack, their eyes staring at nothing. She saw the injuries, the crushed skulls, the bullet holes. Kennedy worked with a grim efficiency, tossing the bodies into the pits like sacks of grain. He would make her say a prayer over them, a mocking request that twisted her faith into another instrument of torture. The psychological toll of living in the kill box began to manifest in Gregoria's behavior. She developed a nervous tic, a constant wringing of her hands until the skin was raw. She startled at loud noises, dropping plates or crying out when a log popped in the fire. She spoke less and less, her voice reducing to a whisper as if she were afraid that speaking aloud would summon more violence. She became a ghost in her own life, moving through the days in a trance of survival. She dissociated from the reality, focusing entirely on the child. The boy was the only thing that was real. Everything else was a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She would sing him soft songs in her native tongue, songs about the mountains and the eagles, trying to build a wall of sound between him and the horror of his father. Kennedy's arrogance grew with every successful murder. He began to boast to Gregoria about his cleverness, treating her as a confidant because he believed she was too terrified to ever turn on him. He would sit at the table counting the gold dust, telling her exactly how much the last victim was worth. He justified his crimes with a twisted logic, claiming that the men were fools who deserved to be separated from their money, that he was simply a smarter predator in a land of prey. He tried to indoctrinate her into his worldview to make her see the logic of the slaughter. Gregoria would nod, her eyes fixed on the floor, while inside she screamed. She did not share his madness, but she was drowning in it. The presence of the child created a dangerous variable. As the boy learned to crawl and then to walk, he became curious. He wanted to explore the cabin, to touch the shiny things on the table, to go near the prohibited door to the back room. Gregoria lived in a state of hypervigilance, constantly scooping him up, distracting him, keeping him away from Kennedy's temper. One afternoon, the boy found a spent shell casing on the floor and put it in his mouth. Kennedy laughed, calling it a good start, but Gregoria snatched it away in horror. She saw the future Kennedy intended for his son, a legacy of blood and violence. She resolved then that she would die before she let the boy become like his father. But she had no power to stop the indoctrination that was slowly beginning. There were moments when the mask nearly slipped. A group of soldiers from Fort Union stopped for water, their uniforms dusty and their sabers rattling. Kennedy was obsequious, playing the humble pioneer, but the soldiers were alert, their eyes scanning the room. One sergeant looked at Gregoria and asked if she was treated well. The question hung in the air, a lifeline thrown across a chasm. Gregoria looked at the sergeant, then at Kennedy's hand resting on the handle of his axe. She saw the promise of murder in his eyes. She forced a smile onto her face, a rictus of terror, and nodded, saying that her husband was a good provider. The sergeant looked unconvinced but had no cause to interfere. They rode away, leaving Gregoria weeping silently into the water barrel, the taste of the lie bitter in her mouth. The summer heat made the cabin stifle. The flies were a plague, drawn by the scent of the butchery in the woods and the waste near the house. They buzzed incessantly, landing on the food, on the baby's face, on the sweat of Kennedy's brow. He cursed them, swatting at the air, but they were a symptom of his own creation. Gregoria hung nets of cheesecloth, trying to keep the insects at bay, but they found every tear and gap. The buzzing became the soundtrack of their lives, a drone of decay that never ceased. It grated on the nerves, heightening the tension, making the air feel thick and unclean. Kennedy's sleep was the sleep of the remorseless, but Gregoria lay awake most nights, listening to the house settle. She heard the creak of the timbers, the rustle of mice, and the breathing of the man who killed for profit lying next to her. She often stared at the knife he kept on the bedside table, her hand twitching with the urge to grab it and end the nightmare. But the fear was too deep. She knew that if she missed, if she failed to kill him instantly, the retribution would be unimaginable. And what of the boy? If she was hanged for murder, who would raise him? The paralysis of the victim kept her in the bed, staring at the dark ceiling, praying for a deliverance that seemed impossible. The physical labor took a toll on her appearance. She was young, but she looked aged, her face lined with stress and her hands rough and scarred. She was thin, for Kennedy ate the best portions of the meat, leaving her the gristle and the broth. She was a shadow of the woman she had been before the cabin. Her eyes held a haunted 1,000-yard stare, the look of someone who has seen too much and can no longer process the visual input of the world. She moved with a stoop, as if carrying an invisible weight. The vibrant woman of the mountains had been hollowed out, filled with the gray ash of the fireplace. As the leaves began to turn in the autumn of 1868, marking a full year of this domestic hell, Gregoria realized that she had survived. She had not gone mad. She had not been killed, and her son was alive. This realization brought a hardened resolve. She was no longer just a victim. She was a survivor. She began to observe Kennedy more closely, not with fear, but with calculation. She noted where he hid the key to the shackles he sometimes used. She noted how much whiskey it took to make him pass out. She noted the loose board on the porch. She was gathering intelligence just as he gathered gold. She did not know when or how, but she knew that the balance would eventually tip. The wolf had brought a wife into the den expecting a sheep, but the sheep was learning to see in the dark. The cabin remained a beacon of death on the trail, a dark star that swallowed travelers. But inside, the dynamic was shifting imperceptibly. The fear was still there, crushing and absolute, but beneath it, a seed of hatred had germinated in Gregoria's heart. She looked at her son playing with a wooden block on the blood-stained floor, and she made a silent vow to the spirits of her ancestors. She would not let this be his life. She would endure the beatings, the scrubbing of the blood, the terror of the nights for as long as it took. But one day, the door would open, and she would walk out. Until then, she would be the silent witness, the keeper of the secrets, the wife in the wolf's den, waiting for the wolf to turn his back. June 6, 1869, dawned with a deceptively cheerful brightness over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The sunlight glinting off the dew that clung to the high mountain grasses. Charles Kennedy stood in the yard of his roadhouse, tightening the cinches on a team of mules hitched to a heavy freight wagon. The vehicle was piled high with crates and burlap sacks, a cargo that to the casual observer looked like the typical accumulation of a frontier trader. There were stacks of woolen blankets, bundles of denim trousers, pairs of leather boots tied together by their laces, and boxes of tools ranging from pickaxes to carpenter's planes. To the citizens of the rapidly expanding settlement of Elizabethtown, this was merely surplus inventory brought to market. To Kennedy, it was the physical residue of the lives he had extinguished, a grim harvest of cotton and leather stripped from the bodies that now lay decomposing in the shallow trenches behind his home. He worked with a Methodical calmness, checking the wheels and the harness, preparing to drive the evidence of his crimes directly into the heart of the community that called him a neighbor. The journey north to Elizabethtown was a slow, rattling progression over the rutted military road that connected the Moreno Valley to the wider world. Kennedy sat on the buckboard, the reins loose in his calloused hands, a lit pipe clenched between his teeth. The wagon creaked and groaned under the weight of the stolen goods, the iron rims of the wheels grinding against the stones. He passed prospectors heading south, men with weary faces and empty pockets, and he nodded to them with the benevolent air of a local patriarch. They waved back, seeing only a hard-working station master making a supply run, completely unaware that the coat he was wearing might have belonged to a man who had vanished from their own camp a month prior. The deception was absolute. Kennedy did not hide in the shadows, he hid in plain sight, using the assumptions of civilized society as his shield. He knew that no one looked at a man driving a wagon in broad daylight and saw a mass murderer. They saw commerce. Elizabethtown rose from the valley floor like a festering wound on the landscape, a chaotic sprawl of raw timber and canvas tents that smelled of sawdust, unwashed humanity, and money. The town was in the throes of a full-blown boom, the population swelling daily with fortune seekers drawn by the news of the big ditch flume and the rich placer deposits. Kennedy guided his team onto the main thoroughfare, forcing his way through the crush of traffic. Freight wagons, pack mules, and mounted riders vied for space in the mud, the air filled with a cacophony of shouting drivers, barking dogs, and the rhythmic pounding of hammers. Kennedy absorbed the energy of the place with a detached amusement. These people were frantic, desperate, and driven by a singular greed that blinded them to everything else. They were sheep, milling about in a pen, and he was the wolf walking among them in shepherd's clothing. He pulled the wagon up in front of a general mercantile store, setting the brake with a hard yank. He climbed down, dusting off his trousers, and walked into the dim, cool interior of the shop. The merchant, a harried man with spectacles and a receding hairline, looked up from his ledger and greeted Kennedy by name. To the town, Charles Kennedy was a known quantity, a fixture of the Southern Pass who ran a rough but reliable stop. Kennedy leaned against the counter, exchanging pleasantries about the weather and the road conditions, his voice steady and rumbling. He told the merchant that he had taken a lot of goods in trade from travelers who couldn't pay in cash, and he was looking to liquidate the surplus. It was a lie he had polished until it shone like truth. The merchant nodded, understanding the barter economy of the frontier, and followed Kennedy out to the wagon to inspect the wares. The transaction that followed was a masterclass in audacity. Kennedy stood by the wagon, handing down pairs of boots that he had pulled from the feet of warm corpses. He held up coats, pointing out the quality of the stitching and the warmth of the wool, omitting the fact that he had scrubbed bloodstains from the linings with lye soap only days before. The merchant examined the goods, haggling over the price of a saddle that had belonged to a young cavalry officer, who was now listed as a deserter. Kennedy negotiated with a firm but fair demeanor, settling on a price that was pure profit for him. He accepted the payment in gold coin and store credit, the weight of the money in his hand feeling cold and solid. He was selling the skins of his victims to the very men who would eventually come looking for them, a cycle of irony that fed his dark sense of superiority. With the business concluded, Kennedy moved his wagon to a livery stable and walked toward the center of the town's social life, the saloons. Elizabethtown boasted dozens of watering holes, but Kennedy favored the larger establishments where the noise provided cover and the whiskey flowed freely. He pushed through the swinging doors of a popular hall, the air inside thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of stale beer. The room was crowded with miners, gamblers, and soldiers, a cross-section of the territory's population. Kennedy found a spot at the bar and ordered a whiskey, throwing a coin onto the polished wood. He stood with his back to the wall, his eyes scanning the room, drinking in the atmosphere of the kill zone. He was soon joined by a group of local miners who recognized him. They clapped him on the shoulder, asking for news from the pass and buying him rounds of drinks. Kennedy played the role of the rustic raconteur, spinning yarns about the bears he had seen and the deep snows of the previous winter. He laughed at their jokes and listened to their complaints about the lack of water for the sluices and the high price of flour. He was the center of a small circle of admirers, a man respected for his toughness and his endurance. As he looked at the faces around him, he wondered which of them would be the next to stop at his cabin. He looked at their necks, calculating the force required to sever the spine. He looked at their belts, estimating the weight of their gold pouches. It was a mental exercise he performed constantly, sharpening his predatory instincts even in the midst of conviviality. The conversation inevitably turned to the dangers of the trail. A miner with a bushy red beard mentioned that a friend of his, a man named Henderson, had left for Taos 3 weeks ago and hadn't been heard from since. The table grew quiet for a moment as the men speculated on the fate of the missing traveler. They blamed the Apache, the weather, or the bandits who roamed the plains to the east. Kennedy listened with a grave expression, nodding solemnly. He offered a theory that perhaps the man had taken a shortcut through the mountains and fallen into a ravine, a tragedy that happened all too often. The men nodded in agreement, accepting Kennedy's wisdom. He was the expert on the trail, after all. He sipped his whiskey, hiding the smirk that threatened to form on his lips. Henderson was not in a ravine. He was under the floor of Kennedy's dining room, and his horse had been sold in Santa Fe a week prior. This ability to manipulate the narrative was Kennedy's greatest weapon. By controlling the information, he deflected suspicion away from himself and onto the phantom threats of the wilderness. He was not just a killer. He was the author of the story that the town believed. He drank with the brother of a man he had bludgeoned to death, looking him in the eye and buying him a beer. The risk of discovery added a spice to the interaction that Kennedy found intoxicating. He was walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers, and he was dancing. The sheer brazenness of his presence in the town square, surrounded by the law and the vigilantes, was a testament to his arrogance. He believed he was smarter than them all, a higher form of life preying on the dull and the slow. Later in the afternoon, Kennedy left the saloon and walked to the dry goods store to spend some of his blood money. He purchased supplies for the cabin, sacks of flour, coffee beans, sugar, and ammunition. He bought a bolt of calico cloth for Gregoria, not out of affection but to keep her presentable for the guests. He bought a new axe handle to replace one that had cracked during a particularly forceful swing. He moved through the aisles of the store, selecting items with the care of a prudent householder. The clerk, a young woman with a bonnet, smiled at him as she wrapped his purchases, commenting on what a good provider he was. Kennedy thanked her, tipping his hat. The duality of his existence was seamless. To the clerk, he was a customer. To the history of the West, he was a monster shopping for the tools of his trade. He loaded the supplies into the wagon, covering them with a tarp. The sun was beginning to dip toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the muddy streets of Elizabethtown. The town was winding up for the night, the music from the dance halls growing louder and the shouts of the drunkards echoing off the wooden facades. Kennedy climbed back onto the wagon seat, checking the load one last time. He had arrived with the remnants of death and was leaving with the sustenance of life. He had converted the dead into bread and bullets. He released the brake and clicked his tongue at the mules, the wagon lurching forward into the traffic. As he rode out of town, he passed the jailhouse, a sturdy log structure with barred windows. He glanced at it with a look of disdain. The law in Elizabethtown was a joke, a chaotic mix of vigilante justice and corrupt officials who were more interested in skimming profits from the gambling dens than investigating missing persons. Kennedy knew that as long as he kept the bodies hidden and the stories consistent, he had nothing to fear from the sheriff. The wilderness was vast, and the law stopped at the edge of the town. In the Moreno Valley, he was the law. He was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. The return journey was quiet, the moon rising over the mountains to light the road. Kennedy smoked his pipe, the smoke trailing behind the wagon like a ghost. He thought about the money in his pocket, calculating how much he had made in the last 6 months. It was a fortune by frontier standards. He could have packed up, moved to California or Mexico, and lived out his days in comfort. But the money was secondary now. The killing had become a compulsion, a necessary function of his being. He could not stop any more than a shark could stop swimming. The cabin was his universe, and he was its dark god. To leave would be to become ordinary again, and that was the one thing he could not tolerate. He arrived back at the cabin well after midnight. The windows were dark, save for the faint glow of the embers in the fireplace. Gregoria opened the door at the sound of the wagon, her face a pale oval in the darkness. She did not ask how the trip was. She simply began to help him unload the supplies. Kennedy worked in silence, carrying the heavy sacks into the storeroom. He tossed the bolt of cloth onto the table, telling her to make a new dress. She touched the fabric with trembling fingers, knowing that it had been bought with the proceeds of murder. Kennedy poured himself a drink from his private stash and sat by the fire, the adrenaline of the day fading into a dull, satisfied fatigue. He looked around the room, the familiar shadows embracing him. The trip to Elizabethtown had been a success. He had tested the perimeter of his cage and found it secure. The town was asleep, dreaming of gold while he sat awake, plotting the next move. He knew that the summer traffic would increase, bringing more sheep to the slaughter. He was ready. He had the supplies, he had the cover, and he had the will. The interaction with the town had not humanized him. It had only confirmed his contempt for humanity. They were so easily fooled, so willing to believe the lie if it was dressed in a smile and a handshake. In the days that followed, Kennedy wore the boots he had kept for himself, a fine pair of cavalry riding boots that fit him perfectly. He walked the floor of the cabin, the heels clicking on the wood, a constant reminder of his victory. He served coffee to the next traveler who stopped, wearing the clothes bought with the last traveler's money. The cycle was perfect, a closed loop of predation that seemed unbreakable. The world outside the valley was a chaotic mess of politics and commerce, but inside the cabin there was only the pure, cold logic of the trap. June turned to July, and the heat of the summer bore down on the mountains. The flies buzzed in the heat, and the smell of the pines was thick and resinous. Kennedy continued his trips to town, becoming a regular face in the markets and the saloons. He expanded his social circle, shaking hands with the mayor and the priest, cementing his reputation as a pillar of the remote community. He was the spider who had learned to walk among the flies without startling them. But even the most careful spider eventually disturbs the web. In his arrogance, Kennedy began to get sloppy. He began to believe that he was invisible, that the eyes of the town were blind. He did not see the way certain men looked at him when he told his stories, the way the timeline of his anecdotes didn't always match the facts. He did not see the suspicion taking root in the minds of men who were as dangerous as he was, men like Clay Allison, who had a nose for blood and a low tolerance for liars. For now, however, Charles Kennedy was the king of the Moreno Valley. He sat on his porch, watching the dust of a wagon train approaching from the north, and smiled. The store was open for business, the shelves were stocked, and the butcher was waiting. The town of Elizabethtown had welcomed him, traded with him, and drank with him, never suspecting that they were breaking bread with a man who had turned the American dream into a nightmare. The blood money was in the bank, or rather, under the floorboards, and business was good. August 12, 1869, brought a stifling dry heat to the Moreno Valley, baking the mud of the trails into a surface as hard as fired pottery. The humidity that usually clung to the mountains had evaporated, leaving the air brittle and thin. In the booming mining camp of Elizabethtown, the mood was shifting from the manic optimism of the initial rush to a darker, more paranoid atmosphere. The gold was still flowing, but so was the whiskey, and with it came a rising tide of violence and suspicion. Men were vanishing. In a frontier town, transience was the norm. People moved on to new strikes or returned east when their money ran out. However, the sheer volume of disappearances concentrated around the southern pass was beginning to create a statistical anomaly that even the most whiskey-addled minds could not ignore. The list of the missing included prospectors, freighters, and even hardened gunmen, all swallowed by the geography of the Sangre de Cristo without leaving a trace. Charles Kennedy remained at the center of this web, outwardly the stoic and reliable proprietor of the trail stop that marked the gateway to the valley. He continued to play his role with a practiced ease, serving meals to the weary and providing shelter to the desperate. Yet the air around him was growing heavy with an unspoken threat. His arrogance, fed by 3 years of successful predation, had begun to curdle into a dangerous complacency. He no longer operated with the absolute hermetic secrecy of the early days. He wore the clothes of his victims in public more frequently. He spent the gold coins with less discretion. He believed that the chaos of the territory was a permanent fog that would forever obscure his actions. But he failed to account for the presence of men who possessed a predatory instinct equal to his own. One such man was Clay Allison. Known throughout the territory as a volatile and lethal gunfighter, Allison was a figure of chaotic violence who operated on his own moral frequency. He was not a lawman, nor was he a vigilante in the traditional sense. He was a force of nature prone to drunken rages and acts of sudden, terrifying aggression. He had a reputation for shooting first and asking questions later, a man who saw the world through the sights of a revolver. Allison had been spending time in the saloons of Elizabethtown, drinking heavily and listening to the talk of the miners. He heard the whispers about the travelers who checked out of the hotels in town, headed south toward Taos, and never arrived. He heard the rumors of the bad medicine in the valley, and his attention, sharpened by paranoia and alcohol, began to drift toward the isolated cabin at the Narrows. On a Tuesday afternoon, Allison rode out of Elizabethtown accompanied by 2 of his associates. They were not riding for pleasure. They were hunting for answers. The sun beat down on their shoulders as they traversed the valley floor, the heat shimmering off the grass. Allison rode a large bay gelding, his posture loose but ready, his eyes scanning the tree line. He did not have proof, but he had a scent. He knew the smell of a setup. He had survived enough ambushes in the war and in the cattle towns to recognize the texture of a trap. The Kennedy cabin, sitting innocuously by the creek, triggered an alarm in his reptilian brain. It was too quiet. It was too perfect. Kennedy was chopping wood in the yard when the 3 riders appeared. He saw them coming from a mile away, the dust of their approach signaling their arrival. He recognized Allison immediately. The man's reputation preceded him, and Kennedy felt a flicker of genuine concern. This was not a greenhorn prospector or a weary traveler. This was a wolf coming to visit. Kennedy set down his axe and wiped his brow, composing his features into a mask of welcoming indifference. He walked to the porch, leaning against the rail, waiting for them to close the distance. He checked the position of the pistol tucked into his belt, ensuring it was loose in the holster. Allison pulled his horse up a few yards from the porch, the animal snorting and stamping in the dust. He did not dismount immediately. He sat in the saddle, looking down at Kennedy with a cold, unblinking stare. The silence stretched out, filled only by the buzzing of the flies and the rush of the creek. Allison looked at the cabin, studying the thick logs, the shuttered windows, and the heavy door. He looked at the barn and the corral. Finally, his gaze returned to Kennedy. He asked for water for the horses and whiskey for the men. His voice was flat, devoid of the usual frontier pleasantries. It was a demand, not a request. Kennedy nodded, gesturing toward the trough for the animals and inviting the men inside. He turned his back to them to open the door, a calculated risk designed to show a lack of fear. The three men dismounted, their spurs jingling as they walked onto the porch. They entered the dim interior of the cabin, their eyes adjusting to the low light. Gregoria was in the kitchen, and upon seeing Allison, she froze. She recognized the violence in him, a different kind than her husband's, but just as deadly. She retreated into the shadows, clutching her son, making herself as small as possible. Kennedy moved behind the bar, retrieving a bottle and 3 dirty glasses. He poured the amber liquid, the sound of the pour loud in the quiet room. Allison took the glass but did not drink immediately. He held it up to the light, swirling the liquid, watching Kennedy over the rim. He began to ask questions. He asked about a man named Franklin, a gambler who had left Elizabethtown 2 weeks prior with a substantial amount of winnings. Allison claimed Franklin owed him money. He asked if Franklin had stopped here. Kennedy met his gaze, his face impassive. He lied smoothly, stating that a man fitting that description had passed through, stopped for a quick coffee, and then rode on south, saying he was in a hurry to reach Santa Fe. It was a standard lie, one Kennedy had used 100 times, but this time it hung in the air with a strange weight. Allison drank the whiskey in one swallow and slammed the glass down on the wood. He walked around the room, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He touched the walls, looked at the hearth, and inspected the items on the shelves. He picked up a pair of spurs lying on a side table. They were silver with a distinctive roll design. He turned them over in his hands, running his thumb over the metal. He asked Kennedy where he got them. Kennedy didn't blink. He said he had won them in a card game from a soldier months ago. Allison looked at the spurs, then at Kennedy, then tossed them back onto the table with a clatter. He didn't believe him. Kennedy knew he didn't believe him. The air in the room was electric with the potential for violence. The confrontation remained verbal, a dance of posturing and veiled threats. Allison was testing Kennedy, pushing him to see if he would crack. He made comments about the number of people who seemed to lose their way in this valley. He mentioned that the ground outside looked soft in places, as if it had been dug up recently. Kennedy countered with talk of badgers and wolves, maintaining his facade of the simple backwoodsman. He offered Allison another drink, trying to shift the dynamic back to host and guest. Allison refused. He stood in the center of the room, radiating a dangerous energy. He told Kennedy that people were starting to talk. He told him that if he found out Kennedy had anything to do with his missing debtor, he would come back and burn the cabin to the ground with Kennedy inside it. The threat was explicit. Kennedy did not recoil. He stood his ground, crossing his massive arms over his chest. He told Allison that he ran a respectable business and that he couldn't help it if the trail was dangerous. He suggested that Allison look for his friend in the ravines or the Apache camps. Allison stared at him for a long moment, his hand hovering near the grip of his revolver. For a second, it seemed as if the slaughter would begin right there. But Allison was not ready. He had suspicion, but he lacked the definitive proof that would justify a killing in the eyes of the few lawmen who mattered. He spat on the floor, turned on his heel, and walked out. His men followed, casting dark looks at Kennedy. Kennedy watched them ride away from the doorway, his heart hammering against his ribs. It had been close. He had looked into the eyes of a man who was his equal in capacity for murder, and he had survived. But instead of fear, he felt a surge of defiance. Who was Clay Allison to question him? This was his valley. These were his victims. The intrusion on his domain infuriated him. He turned back into the room and saw Gregoria watching him with wide, terrified eyes. He screamed at her, venting his adrenaline, blaming her for the dust on the floor or the quality of the whiskey. He needed to reassert his control. The visit from Allison changed the landscape of Kennedy's operations. He could no longer rely on anonymity. He was now a suspect. But rather than retreating or stopping, Kennedy's pathology drove him to escalate. He felt a need to prove that he was untouchable. He rationalized that if he stopped now, it would look suspicious. Business as usual was the best defense. He convinced himself that Allison was just a drunkard blowing hot air, that the town would move on to a new scandal in a week. This denial was the armor of his ego, protecting him from the reality that the net was closing. A week after Allison's visit, a solitary peddler named Isaacs arrived at the cabin. He was a small man driving a wagon loaded with pots, pans, and sewing supplies. He was harmless, carrying very little cash, his wealth tied up in his meager inventory. A rational criminal, knowing he was under scrutiny, would have waved him on. Kennedy did not. He looked at the peddler and saw an opportunity to reassert his dominance over his world. He invited Isaacs in. The murder was messy and enraged. Kennedy did not use the axe or the club. He used his bare hands, strangling the life out of the man in a fit of physical exertion that left him panting and sweating over the corpse. It was not about the profit. It was about the power. It was a direct challenge to the universe that dared to judge him. Disposing of Isaacs was difficult. Kennedy knew he couldn't bury him in the usual spot behind the cabin. Allison had looked there. He had to go further. He loaded the body onto Isaac's own wagon and drove it miles into the forest in the dead of night. He found a deep sinkhole in the limestone, a natural fissure that dropped into the black earth. He dumped the body and the wares into the hole, listening to the crash of the metal pots as they tumbled down into the dark. He returned the wagon to the trail, unhitched the horse, and slapped its flank to send it running toward the plains. He walked back to the cabin in the dark, feeling a grim satisfaction. He had done it again. He had defied the eyes watching him. Back in Elizabethtown, the whispers grew into a murmur. Allison told anyone who would listen that Kennedy was a butcher. He described the way Kennedy looked, the vibe of the cabin, the evasive answers. Others began to come forward with their own stories. Odd noises heard in the night, smoke that smelled like burning fabric, the way Kennedy's wife looked like a beaten dog. The community began to shun the southern pass. Freighters started taking the longer, harder route to the north to avoid the cabin. The flow of victims began to dry up, not because the trail was empty, but because the travelers were being warned. Kennedy noticed the drop in traffic. He sat on his porch for days, whittling, watching the empty road. The silence of the valley was no longer peaceful, it was judgmental. He blamed the town. He blamed the gossiping old women in the saloons. He refused to see his own hand in the isolation. His temper became shorter. The domestic abuse inside the cabin intensified. Gregoria bore the brunt of his frustration. He drank more, starting in the morning and continuing until he passed out at night. The discipline of the early years was gone, replaced by a sloppy, drunken tyranny. One afternoon, a Ute hunting party passed near the cabin. They did not stop. They rode wide of the clearing, keeping the trees between them and the house. Kennedy saw them and shouted a greeting, but they did not turn their heads. To the Utes, the place had become a ghost lodge, a place where the spirits of the dead were restless and angry. They could sense the bad medicine in the earth. This rejection by the native people, who usually navigated the white man's world with a pragmatic detachment, was a damning signal. Even the land's original inhabitants knew that Charles Kennedy was unclean. The financial pressure began to mount. With fewer travelers, there was less cash flow. Kennedy had jars of gold buried, but he couldn't spend them easily without drawing more attention. He was rich in dead men's fortunes, but poor in daily currency. He had to dip into his reserves carefully. He made a trip to town in late August, but the reception was different this time. The merchant was cold, completing the transaction quickly and without conversation. The men in the saloon stopped talking when he entered. He felt the eyes on his back. He drank his whiskey alone, standing at the end of the bar, a pariah in the town he had helped supply. He left Elizabethtown in a rage, whipping his mules into a gallop on the way home. He screamed curses at the empty air, railing against the injustice of it all. In his twisted mind, he was the victim. He was the one being persecuted. He had provided a service. He had built a home, and now they were turning on him. This victimization fueled his madness. He arrived back at the cabin and kicked the door open, startling the baby. He grabbed Gregoria by the hair, demanding to know if she had been signaling to anyone, if she had been part of the conspiracy against him. She wept and denied it, but his paranoia was a fire that consumed reason. September approached, bringing with it the early chill of the high-altitude autumn. The aspen leaves began to quake, signaling the changing season. Kennedy felt the walls closing in. He spent his nights checking the shutters, barring the door, and sitting with his rifle across his knees. He was no longer the hunter. He was the cornered animal. He knew that eventually Allison or someone like him would come back. He began to formulate plans for a defense. He cut loopholes in the logs of the back room. He loaded extra cylinders for his revolvers. He was turning the cabin into a fortress, preparing for a siege that he was sure was coming. The murder of the peddler Isaacs had been a mistake. The man had family in Santa Fe who were expecting him. When he didn't arrive, inquiries were sent north. The letter arrived in Elizabethtown, adding another name to the list, another concrete piece of evidence that pointed south. The local sheriff, a man named Brady, who had been reluctant to act without proof, was coming under increasing pressure from the town council to do something. The wolf of the Washita, Clay Allison, was stirring the pot, threatening to take the law into his own hands if the sheriff wouldn't act. Kennedy's world had shrunk to the few acres of his claim. He paced the floorboards, the very boards that hid the proofs of his guilt. He could hear the bones shifting in the earth outside. He could feel the ghosts gathering in the corners of the room. But he would not run. To run was to admit guilt. To run was to lose everything he had built. He would stay. He would brazen it out. He would kill anyone who came for him. The eye of the man-killer was upon him, but Charles Kennedy stared back, unblinking, into the abyss of his own making. One evening, as the twilight settled purple and cold over the valley, Kennedy stood over the crib of his son. He looked at the boy who was sleeping peacefully, unaware of the monster that stood above him. Kennedy's face was a mask of tragic confusion. He wondered why the world couldn't just let him be. He reached down and touched the boy's cheek with a rough, blood-stained finger. The boy stirred but did not wake. Kennedy turned away, pouring another drink. The bottle was his only friend now. The silence of the cabin was deafening, broken only by the wind that whispered through the cracks, sounding suspiciously like the voices of the dead demanding justice. The stage was set for the final act. The suspicion had hardened into certainty. The fear in the town had turned to anger. And in the dark cabin at the end of the valley, the killer waited. His grip tightening on the handle of his axe, knowing that the reckoning was no longer a possibility but an inevitability. The whispers in the Moreno Valley had become a shout, and soon the shout would become a scream. July 5, 1870, brought a sweltering, oppressive heat to the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, a climatic anomaly that turned the Moreno Valley into a cauldron of stagnant air and buzzing insects. The sun beat down on the log roof of Charles Kennedy's cabin with a relentless intensity. baking the timber until the pitch oozed from the cracks like black tears. Inside, the air was heavy and still, trapped by the thick walls that had been built to keep out the winter cold but now served to incubate the stench of the unwashed living and the secrets of the dead. Kennedy sat at his table, a sheen of sweat coating his forehead, his shirt clinging to his massive frame. He was drinking tepid water from a tin cup, his eyes fixed on the floorboards beneath his boots. The cabin, once his fortress and his sanctuary, was beginning to feel like a prison cell. The pressure from the outside world was mounting. The whispers from Elizabethtown had turned into open accusations, and the physical space available to hide his crimes was rapidly vanishing. The geography of the kill box had reached a saturation point. The ravine to the west was choked with the debris of 3 years of slaughter, the bones scattered by coyotes and the brush grown thick over the remains. The woods behind the cabin, his secondary graveyard, were now so full of shallow trenches that he could scarcely drive a spade into the earth without striking the ribcage of a previous victim or the rotting fabric of a coat. The scavengers, the bears, and the wolves had become too bold, drawn by the constant scent of decay circling the property with a brazen familiarity that unnerved even him. Furthermore, the scrutiny from men like Clay Allison meant that dragging a corpse out into the moonlight was a risk he could no longer afford to take. There were eyes in the forest now, watchers sent by the vigilance committees or perhaps just curious men looking for a bounty. Kennedy knew that to step outside with a body was to invite the hangman to his door. The crisis of disposal came to a head late that afternoon when a solitary traveler named Silas, a drover returning from a failed cattle venture in the Pecos Valley, stopped for a meal. Silas was a large man, heavy with muscle and fat, carrying a saddlebag that clinked with the distinct sound of silver dollars. He was loud, wiping his greasy mouth with his sleeve and complaining about the heat, oblivious to the fact that he was dining with a predator who was calculating the logistics of his murder not in terms of profit but in terms of cubic feet. Kennedy watched him eat, the irritation rising in his chest. He needed the money. His reserves were dwindling as the traffic slowed, but the problem of the body was a heavy calculus. Killing Silas was the easy part, making him disappear was the challenge. When the sun finally dipped below the western ridge, plunging the valley into a bruised twilight, Kennedy made his move. He did not use the axe this time, as the spray of blood would be too difficult to clean in the heat. Instead, he waited until Silas leaned back in his chair, picking his teeth with a splinter of wood. Kennedy walked up behind him, ostensibly to refill his coffee cup, and in one fluid motion wrapped a length of rawhide cord around the man's thick neck. Silas thrashed, his boots drumming a frantic rhythm on the floorboards, overturning the chair and knocking a plate to the floor. Kennedy held on with the grim determination of a bulldog, his muscles straining as he tightened the loop, cutting off the air and the blood flow. The struggle was violent and silent, a grotesque dance in the dim light of the oil lamp. It lasted for 2 minutes until Silas went limp, his face turning a mottled purple, his dead weight sagging against Kennedy's chest. Kennedy let the body drop to the floor with a heavy thud. He stood over it, catching his breath, listening to the silence of the house. Gregoria was in the back room with the boy, cowering behind the locked door, but she would have heard the struggle. She knew what the thumping meant. Kennedy ignored her presence. He looked at the corpse, then at the door, and then at the floor. He could not take Silas outside. The moon was rising bright and full, illuminating the clearing like a stage. If anyone was watching from the tree line, they would see everything. He looked down at the wide pine planks he had laid with his own hands 4 years ago. He knew there was a crawl space underneath, a gap of perhaps 3 feet between the joists and the damp earth, intended to keep the rot away from the timber. It was dark, it was enclosed, and most importantly, it was inside. He moved the heavy table to the side, the legs scraping loudly against the wood. He rolled the body of Silas out of the way, treating it with the indifference one might show a sack of grain. He went to the corner where he kept his tools and retrieved a pry bar and a claw hammer. He knelt in the center of the dining room, the very heart of his home, and began to work on the floor. The nails groaned as he leveraged them out, the rusted iron protesting the movement. He lifted the first plank, releasing a waft of dank, musty air from the darkness below. It smelled of wet earth and fungus, a sharp contrast to the stale heat of the room. He pried up a second plank and then a third, creating a rectangular opening large enough to admit a man. Kennedy took a shovel and lowered himself into the hole. The space was cramped and claustrophobic. The dirt floor of the crawl space was cool, untouched by the summer heat. He had to crouch, his back scraping against the underside of the floor joists, spiderwebs brushing against his face. He lit a candle and set it on a stone, the flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows against the foundation logs. He began to dig. The earth here was hard-packed clay, dry and stubborn. He hacked at it with the short-handled spade, sweating profusely in the confined space. He wasn't digging a proper Christian grave. He was digging a disposal pit. He worked with a feverish intensity, tossing the loose dirt into a pile against the far wall of the foundation. He needed a hole 3 feet deep and 6 feet long. Above him, the house was silent. He could hear the wind whistling through the eaves, a sound that seemed miles away. Down here in the belly of the cabin, the only reality was the dirt and the labor. He dug for an hour, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his knuckles scraping against the rocks in the soil. When the pit was deep enough, he climbed out, his clothes stained with red clay. He dragged the body of Silas to the edge of the opening. The dead man was heavy, a dead weight that refused to cooperate. Kennedy grabbed him by the ankles and shoved him feet first into the hole. The body slid down with a rustle of fabric, landing in the pit with a dull crunch. Kennedy jumped back down, arranging the limbs, forcing the arms across, the chest to make the profile as low as possible. He did not say a prayer. He did not close the man's staring eyes. He simply shoveled the dirt back over the face, burying the evidence of his crime beneath the very spot where he ate his breakfast. He packed the earth down with his boots, stomping on the grave to ensure it was level. He wanted no mound to impede the replacement of the floorboards. When the dirt was flat, he climbed out of the hole and began the process of restoration. He laid the planks back in their original order, hammering the nails back into their existing holes to hide the tampering. He swept the loose dirt from the cracks, scrubbing the wood with a wet rag to remove the clay footprints. He moved the table back into position, centering it exactly over the fresh grave. He stepped back and looked at his handiwork. To the untrained eye, nothing had changed. The room was the same rustic dining area it had always been. But Kennedy knew. He knew that 6 inches. He knew. Beneath his boots, a man was beginning the slow process of returning to dust. The next morning, the sun rose with the same punishing heat. Kennedy woke early, a headache throbbing behind his eyes from the exertion and the whiskey he had consumed to calm his nerves. He walked into the main room and stopped. The air had a subtle underlying note that hadn't been there before, a faint metallic tang mixed with the scent of disturbed earth. It was the smell of the grave. He ignored it, opening the windows to let the breeze blow through. He brewed a strong pot of coffee, the aroma filling the room and masking the other scent. He sat at the table, his feet resting directly over Silas's chest, and drank his coffee. He felt a strange sense of power. He was literally walking on his victims. He had incorporated them into the foundation of his life. 2 days later, a pair of prospectors arrived. They were hungry and tired, asking for a hot meal. Kennedy welcomed them, seating them at the table. He watched them eat their bacon and beans, fighting back a dark, manic laughter that bubbled in his throat. If they only knew. If they only knew that the man they were chatting with had buried a corpse directly beneath their chairs less than 48 hours ago. The secret was a delicious, toxic secret that fed his ego. He felt superior to them, superior to their ignorance. He was the master of a reality they couldn't even comprehend. The prospectors ate quickly, paid their bill, and left, complaining about a strange, musty smell in the room. Kennedy told them it was just dry rot in the logs, a common problem in the mountains. They believed him. Everyone believed him. As July wore on, the heat intensified, and the reality of the burial solution began to present problems. The crawl space was not deep enough to be a true cold cellar, and the warmth of the cabin seeped down into the earth. The decomposition process, accelerated by the summer temperatures, began to assert itself. A sweetness began to pervade the air, a cloying, sickly scent that hung in the corners of the room and refused to dissipate. Kennedy burned pinon wood in the fireplace all day, even in the heat, claiming he was drying out the damp. He smoked his pipe incessantly, filling the room with thick clouds of tobacco smoke. He sprinkled lye on the floorboards, sweeping it into the cracks, trying to chemically burn the smell away. Gregoria was the first to break under the strain of the new arrangement. She knew what he had done. She had seen the dirt on his clothes. She had heard the hammering in the night. Now she had to work in that room, walking back and forth over the grave to serve the meals. The smell made her gag. She tried to keep the baby outside as much as possible, terrified that the spirit of the dead man would reach up through the floor and curse the child. When she had to be inside, she moved along the walls, avoiding the center of the room, her eyes wide with terror. Kennedy noticed her avoidance and forced her to stand on the spot, grabbing her arm and holding her there. His face twisted in a cruel sneer. He told her there was nothing there but dirt. He was trying to bully her into accepting his reality, trying to force her to share in his madness. The success of the first indoor burial, despite the smell, emboldened Kennedy. It was convenient. It was private. And it solved the problem of the watchers outside. A week later, he killed again. This time it was a young man, barely more than a boy, who had been traveling to join his father in the mines. The boy had a gold watch and a new rifle. Kennedy shot him in the back of the head while he was looking at a map on the wall. The crack of the pistol was deafening in the enclosed space, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Kennedy did not hesitate. He moved the table, pried up a different section of the floorboards, this time closer to the hearth, and dug another pit. The crawl space was becoming a catacomb. Kennedy had to maneuver carefully in the dark hole to avoid disturbing the first grave. He was creating a grid of death beneath his home. He buried the boy, covered him, and replaced the floor. The routine was becoming mechanical. The horror of the act had completely eroded, replaced by a grim pragmatism. He was simply storing the waste product of his business. The cabin was a machine, and he was the operator. The floorboards were the lid of the trash can. By the end of July, there were 3 bodies beneath the dining room floor. The atmosphere in the cabin was thick with a miasma that was both physical and psychological. The smell was undeniable now, a heavy, rotting stench that greeted anyone who opened the door. Kennedy stopped trying to make excuses for it. If travelers mentioned it, he glared at them until they stopped talking. He was daring them to challenge him. His drinking escalated to a lethal level. He was consuming a quart of whiskey a day, his eyes permanently bloodshot, his movements jerky and unpredictable. He sat in his chair for hours, staring at the floor, muttering to the men beneath his feet. He was holding court with the dead. The presence of the bodies changed the acoustics of the room. The floor felt solid, heavy, as if the density of the earth below had increased. The hollow sound of footsteps was gone, replaced by a dull thud. Kennedy imagined he could feel the heat rising from the ground, the heat of decay. He began to have nightmares, vivid dreams where the floorboards split open and the hands of the dead reached up to drag him down into the darkness. He would wake up screaming, grabbing for his pistol, firing shots into the shadows. Gregoria would huddle in the corner, shielding the boy, praying that the bullet wouldn't find them. One night, a heavy rainstorm swept through the valley, the water pouring off the roof and soaking the ground around the cabin. The water seeped under the foundation, turning the crawlspace into a mud pit. The moisture reactivated the decomposition, sending a fresh wave of stench up through the floor. It was unbearable. Kennedy sat at the table, a handkerchief tied around his face, pouring whiskey down his throat to numb his senses. He looked like a madman, a masked ghoul presiding over a banquet of rot. He realized in a moment of clarity through the haze of alcohol that he had trapped himself. He could not leave, for the evidence was literally part of the house. He could not stay, for the house was becoming uninhabitable. He was a prisoner of his own atrocities. He began to take his meals on the porch, eating in the open air to escape the smell. He left the door open, hoping the wind would scour the room clean. But the scent clung to the logs, to the furniture, to his clothes. He carried the smell of death with him wherever he went. When he rode into Elizabethtown for supplies, people stepped back from him, wrinkling their noses. They thought it was just poor hygiene, the stink of a mountain man who lived too rough. They didn't know they were smelling the putrefaction of their missing friends. This olfactory brand isolated him further. He was becoming a biological hazard. The psychological weight of the bodies began to crush what little sanity he had left. He started talking to the floorboards. He would ask Silas if he was comfortable. He would ask the young boy if he knew what time it was. It was a mocking, delirious commentary that terrified Gregoria more than his violence. She saw that he was no longer just a cruel man. He was a man whose soul had been completely devoured. He was hollow, filled only with the echoes of his crimes. She realized that the end was coming. This could not sustain itself. The house was full. The ground was full. The air was full. Kennedy's paranoia regarding the floor became an obsession. He would not let Gregoria sweep certain areas, afraid she might dislodge a loose board. He checked the nails every day, pounding them down until the heads were buried deep in the wood. He placed heavy chests and barrels over the spots where the digging had been most recent, creating physical barriers to discovery. He was fortifying the interior of the cabin against inspection. He knew that if the sheriff ever came in with a pry bar, it would be over in 5 minutes. The evidence was not circumstantial. It was anatomical. On the last day of July, a traveler stopped and asked for water. He did not come inside. He stood on the porch, his horse drinking from the trough. He mentioned to Kennedy that the air around the cabin smelled sweet, like a dead elk. Kennedy looked at the man, his hand twitching toward his knife. He wanted to kill him just for the comment, just to silence the voice that spoke the truth. But he held back. There was no room. There was literally no room left to hide him. He let the man go, watching him ride away, hate burning in his gut like a coal. The logistical limit of his murder spree had been reached. He had filled his world with death until there was no space left for life. The cabin stood in the moonlight, a dark square against the trees. It looked peaceful, a pioneer home in the wilderness. But inside it was a crypt. The dining table was a tombstone. The floor was a cemetery. And the man sitting in the dark, listening to the buzzing of the nocturnal flies, was the caretaker of a hell he had built plank by plank. Charles Kennedy had brought the horror inside, and now he had to live with it. He was sleeping on top of his sins, and they were beginning to rot. The bones beneath the floorboards were silent, but their presence screamed louder than any voice in the valley. September 25th, 1870. Arrived not with the crisp promise of autumn, but with a heavy, stagnant atmosphere that hung over the Moreno Valley like a shroud. The leaves on the aspen trees had turned a sickly yellow, dropping prematurely to the ground as if the earth itself was rejecting the season. Inside the log cabin that commanded the southern approach to the pass, the air was unbreathable. It was a noxious cocktail of stale tobacco smoke, unwashed bodies, the lingering fumes of cheap whiskey, and the sweet, cloying scent of decay that seeped relentlessly from the floorboards. Charles Kennedy sat in his usual chair by the hearth, a position he rarely left these days, his massive body slumped in a posture of aggressive lethargy. He was a man eroding from the inside out, his mind eaten away by the syphilis of his own conscience and the relentless pickling of alcohol. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, were now bloodshot and glassy, darting around the room in a frenzy of paranoia, tracking the movements of shadows that existed only in his delirium. The cabin had ceased to be a place of business and had become a pressure vessel waiting for a spark. The traffic on the trail had dwindled to almost nothing, the travelers warned away by the dark rumors circulating in Elizabethtown, leaving Kennedy alone with his demons and his captives. He felt the isolation as a physical weight, a crushing force that amplified every sound and every irritation. The buzzing of a fly sounded like a scream, the creak of a timber sounded like a footstep. He was trapped in the center of his own web, unable to leave because of the evidence beneath his feet, and unable to stay because the walls were closing in. He drank to silence the voices in the floor, but the whiskey only made them louder. It made him mean. It stripped away the last vestiges of the calculating predator and left behind only a brute animal, reactive and dangerous. Gregoria moved through this domestic hell with the silence of a ghost. She had learned over the last 3 years that invisibility was her only shield. She walked on the balls of her feet, avoiding the loose boards that squeaked, keeping her head down and anticipating Kennedy's needs before he could voice them. Her entire existence was focused on one thing: the survival of her son. The boy was now a toddler, a curious and energetic child who did not understand the rules of the prison he had been born into. He wanted to run, he wanted to shout, he wanted to play. Every noise he made was a risk. Gregoria kept him close, whispering to him, trying to keep him quiet with scraps of food and improvised toys. She saw the way Kennedy looked at the boy. It was not the look of a father. It was the look of a man watching a parasite. Kennedy saw the child as another mouth to feed, another noise to tolerate, and increasingly as a witness. The morning of the 25th began with a deceptive calm. Kennedy woke late, his temper foul from a night of terrors. He demanded breakfast, and Gregoria served him the last of the bacon and stale biscuits. He ate with his hands, grease coating his beard, his eyes fixed on the empty trail outside the window. He was brooding on his misfortunes, blaming the town, the sheriff, and even the weather for his predicament. He felt besieged. The world was against him. As he reached for the whiskey bottle to start the day's drinking, the boy, who had been playing in the corner with a wooden spoon, dropped it. The clatter of the wood on the floor was sharp and sudden. Kennedy flinched, his hand jerking, spilling the precious liquor onto the table. He roared, a sound of pure, animalistic rage. He turned on the child, his face purple with fury. Gregoria was there in an instant, scooping the boy up and retreating to the far side of the room, her body acting as a shield. She murmured apologies, promising to keep him quiet, her eyes wide with terror. Kennedy stared at them, his chest heaving. He did not strike them then. He simply pointed a shaking finger at them and told them to get out of his sight. Gregoria fled to the back room, locking the door with trembling fingers. She huddled on the pallet, clutching the boy, listening to Kennedy pace the floor of the main room. Thump, thump, thump. The sound of his heavy boots walking over the graves of his victims. The day dragged on in a suffocating tension. The heat built up inside the cabin, the sun beating on the roof. In the main room, Kennedy drank steadily. He consumed a pint, then a quart. His mood shifted from anger to a maudlin self-pity and then back to a cold, simmering violence. He started talking to himself, arguing with the ghosts. He accused the floor of conspiring against him. He shouted at the walls. In the back room, the air was stifling. The boy began to cry, a low, whining sound of discomfort and boredom. Gregoria tried to hush him, rocking him, singing softly, but the child was hot and thirsty. His cries grew louder, penetrating the thin barrier of the door. Kennedy heard the crying. It drilled into his skull like an auger. It was the sound of weakness. It was the sound of accusation. He kicked the door, the wood splintering under the impact of his boot. He ordered Gregoria to shut the child up. She put her hand over the boy's mouth, tears streaming down her face, begging the spirits for mercy. The crying stopped for a moment, stifled by her hand. But as soon as she relaxed her grip, it started again, louder this time. The boy was terrified now, sensing the danger radiating from the man on the other side of the door. By late afternoon, the whiskey was gone. Kennedy was in a state of toxic psychosis. He needed more alcohol, but there was none. The deprivation triggered a violent reaction. He needed to destroy something. He needed to assert his dominance over his crumbling kingdom. He kicked the door to the back room again, this time breaking the latch. The door swung open, hitting the wall with a crash. Kennedy stood in the doorway, swaying slightly, his silhouette dark against the light from the main room. He looked at Gregoria and the boy cowering in the corner. He did not see his wife and son. He saw the source of his irritation. He saw the thing that was making the noise. He advanced into the room. Gregoria scrambled back, pressing herself against the logs, holding the boy so tight he began to scream. Kennedy reached down, his hands like bear paws. He did not grab Gregoria, he grabbed the child. He tore the boy from her arms with a force that bruised her skin. Gregoria lunged at him, scratching at his face, screaming, abandoning all fear in a desperate attempt to save her young. Kennedy backhanded her, a blow that sent her crashing into the wall. She slumped to the floor, dazed, blood trickling from her mouth. Kennedy carried the screaming child into the main room. He held the boy by one arm, dangling him like a caught rabbit. The child kicked and shrieked, his small face red with terror. Kennedy walked to the fireplace. A fire was burning there despite the heat, consuming the trash and the debris of the cabin. The flames leaped and danced, hungry and bright. Kennedy looked at the fire, then at the boy. A madness took hold of him, a final severance from the human race. He shouted that he would give the boy something to cry about. He shouted that he was the master of this house. With a grunt of exertion, Kennedy swung the child. He did not simply drop him. He used his immense strength to dash the boy against the rough stone of the chimney breast. The sound was sickening, a wet, dull crack that silenced the screaming instantly. The boy's body went limp, a broken doll in the giant's hand. Kennedy did not stop. The momentum of his rage was not yet spent. He turned and threw the small, lifeless body directly into the roaring fire. Gregoria, crawling on her hands and knees from the back room, witnessed the act. She saw her son fly through the air. She saw him land in the flames. A sound came out of her throat that was not human. It was a primal, shattering wail that seemed to tear the very air apart. She tried to rush to the fire to pull him out, but Kennedy turned on her, blocking her path. He stood between her and the hearth, his face twisted into a mask of triumph. He pushed her back, knocking her to the floor again. He told her to let it burn. He told her it was better this way. The smell of singing hair and burning flesh began to fill the room, mixing with the other odors of the house. It was a scent that would haunt Gregoria for the rest of eternity. She lay on the floor, staring at the flames, her mind fracturing. The shock was so profound that her body shut down. She could not move. She could not scream anymore. She could only watch as the fire consumed the only thing in the world she loved. Kennedy stood by the hearth watching the flames, muttering that he had finally gotten some peace and quiet. He picked up the poker and prodded the fire, ensuring the work was done. After what seemed like an hour, Kennedy turned away from the fire. He walked to the table and sat down, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He looked at Gregoria, who was still lying on the floor, her eyes fixed on the ashes. He told her to get up. He told her to cook him some dinner. The banality of the command was more horrifying than the violence. He had just murdered his own son, and now he wanted a meal. It was the ultimate display of his psychopathy. He had no concept of the gravity of his actions. To him, the problem was solved. The noise had stopped. Life continued. Gregoria did not move. She could not. Kennedy growled at her, threatening to give her the same treatment as the boy. He threw a tin cup at her, hitting her in the shoulder. The pain roused her slightly. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in years. She did not see a husband or a master or a man. She saw a demon. She saw a creature that had to be destroyed. The fear that had paralyzed her for so long evaporated, burned away by the fire that had taken her son. In its place, a cold, hard resolve formed in her heart. She was no longer afraid of dying. She was already dead inside. The only thing left was to ensure that he died too. She slowly pushed herself up. Her movements were stiff and mechanical. She walked to the stove, not looking at the fireplace. She began to prepare the food. She moved with a strange, eerie calm. Kennedy watched her, satisfied that he had broken her completely. He believed that this final act of terror had secured her obedience forever. He did not see the change in her eyes. He did not see that the woman who was cutting the salt pork was plotting his execution. She served him the food. He ate voraciously, his appetite unaffected by the slaughter. He chewed the meat, wiping the grease on his trousers. He complained about the heat. He complained about the lack of whiskey. Gregoria stood by the wall, her hands clasped in front of her, waiting. She was waiting for the crash. She knew the pattern. After the rage, after the food, came the stupor. The adrenaline would fade, the alcohol would take its final toll, and he would sleep. The sun went down, plunging the valley into darkness. Kennedy lit the oil lamp, the yellow light casting long shadows in the room. He sat in his chair, staring into the dying fire where the charred remains of his son lay among the logs. He began to nod off, his chin dropping to his chest, then snapping back up. He muttered incoherently. Finally, his head fell forward, his heavy breathing turning into a rhythmic snore. He was asleep. He was vulnerable. Gregoria looked at the axe standing in the corner. She looked at the knife on the table. Her hands twitched. She wanted to rush him, to hack him to pieces while he slept. But a voice of caution whispered in her mind. He was strong, even in sleep. If she missed, if he woke up, he would kill her, and no one would ever know what happened here. She needed help. She needed the world to see this. She needed to expose the charnel house to the light of day. She needed to bring the mob. She knew she had to escape, but the door was barred, and the noise of lifting the heavy wooden beam would surely wake him. She looked at the windows. They were shuttered and nailed shut from the outside to prevent people from looking in. She was sealed in the box. Panic began to rise, but she pushed it down. She looked around the room, searching for an exit. Her eyes fell on the chimney. The fireplace was wide, built of rough stone. The fire had burned down to embers. It was dangerous, but it was the only way. She waited until his snoring was deep and regular. She moved silently to the hearth. The heat was intense. She could see the small, blackened bones of her son among the ashes. She forced herself not to look, to detach herself from the horror. She had to survive to avenge him. She grabbed a heavy woolen blanket from the bed and soaked it in the water bucket. She wrapped it around herself, covering her head and her body. She stepped into the fireplace. The embers hissed as her wet boots touched them. The smoke stung her eyes. She reached up, finding the handholds in the rough masonry. She began to climb. The chimney was narrow and choked with soot. She scraped her knees and elbows against the hot stone. The smoke filled her lungs, making her want to cough, but she held her breath. She climbed higher, inch by inch, fighting the claustrophobia and the heat. Kennedy stirred in his chair. He grunted, shifting his weight. Gregoria froze in the chimney, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she thought he must hear it. She hung there, suspended in the dark throat of the house, waiting. Kennedy settled back down, his snoring resuming. She exhaled and pulled herself up again. She could see a patch of stars above her. The cool air of the night was touching her face. She reached the top of the chimney and pulled herself out onto the roof. The air was cold and clean, a shock after the poisonous atmosphere of the cabin below. She lay on the sod roof for a moment, gasping for breath, the soot staining her face and hands. She rolled to the edge of the low roof and dropped to the ground. She landed in the soft dirt of the garden, the impact jarring her ankles. She did not stop. She scrambled to her feet and looked back at the cabin. It sat there, dark and silent, a tomb containing her dead child and the sleeping monster. She turned north. Elizabethtown was miles away. The trail was dark and treacherous. She had no coat, only the damp blanket. She had no weapon. But she had a fire burning inside her that was hotter than the one in the hearth. She began to run. She ran with a desperate, loping gait, her moccasins slapping against the hard earth. She ran for her life. She ran for her son. She ran to bring the judgment of God down upon Charles Kennedy. The night was vast and indifferent. The coyotes howled in the distance, a sound that used to terrify her, but now she felt a kinship with them. She was a creature of the wild now, hunted and desperate. She ignored the stones that cut her feet and the branches that whipped her face. She focused only on the lights of the town in the distance, the faint glow against the clouds that marked the presence of civilization. Inside the cabin, Charles Kennedy slept on. He dreamed of gold. He dreamed of silence. He did not know that the bird had flown the cage. He did not know that his reign of terror had ended the moment he threw that child into the fire. He was a dead man breathing, his time measured not in years, but in the hours it would take a grieving mother to run 12 miles through the dark. The slaughter of innocents had been his final mistake. He had broken the only thing that had kept his secret. The valley seemed to watch Gregoria run. The wind pushed at her back, urging her forward. The trees seemed to part to let her pass. The very land soaked in the blood of Kennedy's victims wanted him gone. Gregoria was the instrument of that desire. She was the messenger of death, carrying the news that would light the fuse of the Lynch mob. She ran until her lungs burned, until her legs felt like lead, but she did not stop. She would not stop until Charles Kennedy was hanging from a rope. October 3rd, 1870, began in the dark, smoky confines of John Pearson's saloon in Elizabethtown, a place where the air was perpetually thick with the smell of stale beer and unwashed miners. It was well past midnight, yet the room was still crowded with men trying to drink away the cold reality of the coming winter. The noise was a dull roar of shouting, laughter, and the clinking of glass, a chaotic symphony that masked the sound of the door crashing open. When Gregoria Kennedy stumbled across the threshold, the noise did not stop instantly, but it died away in a ripple effect, silence spreading from the entrance to the back of the room as the patrons took in the sight of the woman standing in the frame. She was a vision of absolute devastation, wrapped in a filthy, soot-stained blanket, her feet bleeding and bound in rags, her face a mask of ash and terror. She looked less like a human being and more like a revenant that had clawed its way out of the earth to haunt the living. She collapsed onto the sawdust-covered floor, her legs finally failing her after the 12-mile run through the freezing darkness. Several men rushed to help her, lifting her onto a chair and calling for water and whiskey. Among them was Clay Allison, the wolfish gunfighter who had long suspected the darkness residing in the Moreno Valley. He pushed through the crowd, his presence parting the onlookers, and knelt beside her. He did not offer empty platitudes. He demanded to know what had happened. Gregoria gasped for breath, her throat raw from the smoke and the cold air. She did not scream. She spoke with a terrifying, flat clarity that carried to every corner of the silent room. She told them that Charles Kennedy had murdered their son. She told them he had bashed the child's head against the stones and thrown him into the fire. She told them about the travelers buried under the floor. The reaction in the saloon was not immediate outrage, but a moment of stunned, collective processing. The magnitude of the crime she described was beyond the pale of even the rough frontier morality. Killing a man in a fair fight was one thing. Murdering a traveler for his gold was a hanging offense. But slaughtering one's own child and burning the body was an act of such depravity that it dehumanized the perpetrator instantly. Clay Allison stood up, his face pale with a cold, focused fury. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the miners, the merchants, and the drifters. He did not need to make a speech. He simply stated that they were going to the valley. The mob formed not out of chaotic anger, but with a grim, military precision. Men moved to the door, checking their revolvers and buckling their gun belts. They were no longer patrons of a saloon. They were the instruments of a necessary extermination. The group that rode out of Elizabethtown an hour later consisted of 12 heavily armed men, their horses' hooves thundering on the hard-packed dirt of the road. The moon was high and bright, casting a silver light over the frosted landscape, illuminating the path that Gregoria had just traversed. She did not ride with them. She remained in the care of the saloon-keeper's wife, staring blankly at the wall. The men rode in silence, the only sounds the creak of leather and the snorting of the horses. Allison rode at the front, his eyes fixed on the southern horizon. He was the tip of the spear, a man whose violent nature had finally found a target that completely justified its release. They pushed the animals hard, driven by a need to confirm the horror and to dispense the remedy before the sun rose. They reached the edge of the clearing in the Moreno Valley in the pre-dawn hours. The cabin sat dark and silent against the tree line, smoke still curling lazily from the chimney. It looked peaceful, a lie constructed of timber and stone. The mob dismounted, tethering their horses in the trees to avoid alerting the prey. They approached the house on foot, spreading out to surround the perimeter, cutting off any avenue of escape. Allison and 3 others moved to the front door, their boots making no sound on the damp earth. The air around the cabin was heavy with the smell that Gregoria had lived with for years, a sweet, cloying odor of death that the cool night air could not disperse. Allison did not knock. He raised his heavy boot and kicked the door just below the latch. The wood splintered with a loud crack and the door swung inward, banging against the interior wall. The men rushed into the room, their weapons drawn, expecting a fight. Charles Kennedy was asleep in his chair by the hearth, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the floor beside him. He started awake at the noise, blinking in the confusion of a drunken stupor. He tried to rise, his hand reaching for the knife on the table, but he was too slow and too intoxicated. 2 men were upon him instantly, pinning his arms and dragging him out of the chair. He roared in protest, a confused, bullish sound demanding to know what they were doing in his house. They threw him onto the floor, holding him down with the weight of their bodies. Allison did not look at Kennedy. He walked straight to the fireplace. The fire had burned down to a bed of gray ash and glowing embers. He picked up the iron poker and began to sift through the remains. The room was silent, save for Kennedy's heavy breathing and the scrape of the metal tool on the stone. Allison pushed aside a half-burnt log and froze. There, in the center of the hearth, clearly visible in the light of the lanterns the men had brought, were the charred, unmistakable remains of a small human skull and the ribcage of a child. The bones were white and brittle, stripped of flesh by the heat, a gruesome testament to the truth of Gregoria's story. Allison turned to the men, his face a mask of revulsion. He pointed to the hearth. One by one, the hardened frontiersmen looked into the ashes. Some turned away, retching. Others cursed softly. The confirmation of the infanticide stripped away any lingering doubt or hesitation. Kennedy, seeing the discovery, began to babble. He claimed it was an accident. He claimed the boy had fallen. He blamed Gregoria, screaming that she was a liar and a witch who had done it herself. His voice was high and desperate, the bluster of the bully collapsing into the cowardice of the captured rat. But the mob was not finished. They remembered the other part of the testimony. Allison ordered the table to be moved. He took a pry bar from the corner and jammed it into the gap between the floorboards in the center of the room. The nails groaned as he leveraged the wood up. He ripped the plank free and tossed it aside. Then another, then another. As the opening in the floor grew, the smell that rose from the crawl space was overpowering. It was a physical wall of stench, the concentrated gas of decomposition. The men covered their noses with their bandanas, coughing and gagging. Allison lowered the lantern into the hole. The light revealed the nightmare beneath their feet. The soil was lumpy and uneven, and in the shallow depressions the shapes of men were visible. A hand protruded from the dirt here. A boot stuck out there. The earth was literally packed with the dead. The men realized with a dawning horror that they were standing on a mass grave. Kennedy had been eating, sleeping, and living on top of his victims. The sheer scale of the atrocity was difficult to comprehend. This was not just murder, it was an industrial processing of human life. The floor was a lid on hell, and they had just opened it. They dragged Kennedy out of the cabin, hauling him by his hair and his collar. He fought them now, realizing that there would be no trial and no sheriff. He kicked and bit, screaming for mercy, promising them gold, promising them anything if they would just let him go. They dragged him through the dirt of the yard, past the woodpile where he had struck down so many men, and out toward the edge of the forest. The sun was just beginning to crest the peaks of the Sangre de Cristo, bathing the valley in a cold, indifferent light. The birds were starting to sing, a cheerful counterpoint to the grim procession moving toward the tall pine tree near the creek. A rope was produced from a saddlebag. It was a stiff, hemp lariat used for roping cattle, now repurposed for the final act of justice. A noose was fashioned with practiced efficiency. They did not bother to tie his hands. They wanted him to struggle. They wanted him to feel every second of his end. They threw the end of the rope over a sturdy branch that extended horizontally from the trunk of the pine. Kennedy was hauled to his feet beneath the branch. He was weeping now, snot and tears running into his beard, his legs shaking so badly he could barely stand. He looked at the faces of the mob, searching for a sympathetic eye, but found only granite, hard stares. Clay Allison stood directly in front of him, looking into the eyes of the man-killer. He told Kennedy to look at the sun, for it was the last time he would ever see it. The noose was placed around Kennedy's neck and tightened. The rough fibers bit into the skin. There was no horse to kick away, no drop to break the neck instantly. This was a heave and hoe hanging, the cruelest form of execution. 3 men grabbed the free end of the rope. At a signal from Allison, they pulled. Kennedy was jerked off his feet, his hands clawing desperately at the rope around his throat. He was hoisted 4 feet into the air, his body twisting and thrashing. His legs kicked at the empty air, searching for purchase that wasn't there. The strangulation was slow. The rope cut off the air to his lungs and the blood to his brain, but not immediately. Kennedy gasped and choked, his face turning a dark, mottled purple. His eyes bulged from their sockets, staring wildly at the men who were killing him. He fought for a long time, his immense physical strength working against him, prolonging the agony. The men watched in silence, holding the rope taut. There was no cheering. There was only the sound of the rope creaking on the branch and the terrible wet sounds of a man dying by inches. It took 10 minutes for the struggles to cease. His movements slowed, then became sporadic twitches, and finally he hung still, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. They tied the rope off to the trunk of the tree and stepped back. The silence of the valley returned, heavier than before. They left him hanging there for an hour, ensuring that he was truly dead. The sun rose higher, illuminating the gruesome tableau. The monster of the Moreno Valley was nothing more than a sack of meat swinging on a string. But for Clay Allison, death was not enough. The magnitude of Kennedy's crimes required a symbol, a message that would be understood by anyone who passed through the territory. He walked to the tree and looked up at the corpse. He drew his heavy Bowie knife from its sheath, the steel glinting in the sunlight. He ordered the men to lower the body. They untied the rope and let Kennedy drop to the ground in a heap. Allison knelt beside the corpse. He grabbed Kennedy by the hair, lifting the head. With a grim, workmanlike motion, he began to cut. He severed the skin and the muscle of the neck, the knife grating against the vertebrae. It was a butchery that mirrored what Kennedy had done to so many others, a final, ironic desecration. Allison worked until the head was separated from the torso. He stood up, holding the severed head by the long, dark hair. The eyes were still open, staring with a fixed, glassy gaze. The mouth was open, the tongue protruding, frozen in a silent scream. A sack was brought forward and the head was dropped inside. The body was left where it lay, food for the coyotes and the carrion birds that Kennedy had fed for so long. The men mounted, their horses, the mood somber and dark. They had done what was necessary, but the stain of the violence would not wash off easily. Allison tied the sack to his saddle horn. They turned their horses north and began the ride back to Elizabethtown. The return journey was a procession of victory, but without joy. They rode past the confused travelers on the trail, men who looked at the grim faces of the posse and gave them a wide berth. When they reached the town, it was mid-morning. The streets were busy with the daily commerce of the mining camp. The arrival of the mob caused a stir. People stopped what they were doing, sensing that something momentous had occurred. Allison rode straight to John Pearson's saloon, the place where the nightmare had been revealed the night before. He dismounted and untied the sack. He walked to the front of the saloon where a tall, sturdy post stood near the entrance, used for hitching horses. He took the head out of the sack. A gasp went through the crowd that had gathered. The head of Charles Kennedy was a grotesque object, swollen and purple, the neck ragged and bloody. Allison took a large spike and a hammer. He climbed onto a barrel and drove the spike through the base of the skull, securing the head to the top of the post. He stepped back, wiping his hands on his trousers. The crowd stared in silence. There, staring blindly out at the main street of Elizabethtown, was the face of the man who had terrorized the trail for years. It was a warning, a trophy, and a confirmation. The rumors were true. The monster was real and he was dead. Allison turned to the crowd and spoke. He told them to look at the face of the child killer. He told them that justice had been served. He told them that the Moreno Valley was open again. In the days that followed, the head on the stake became a macabre tourist attraction. Miners and townspeople filed past to gawk at it, to spit on it, to throw stones at it. It began to rot in the sun, the skin drying and turning black, the features shriveling. It became a memento mori, a reminder of the brutality of the frontier. The birds pecked at the eyes and the flies laid their eggs in the mouth. It was the ultimate humiliation for a man who had sought total control and dominance. He was now an object of disgust, a piece of rotting garbage on a stick. Gregoria never returned to the cabin. She was taken in by a family in town, but she did not stay long. The memories were too heavy. She drifted away, disappearing into the vastness of the territory, a survivor carrying a burden that no one could share. The cabin in the valley stood empty. The locals refused to go near it. They said it was cursed. They said you could hear the crying of a child and the groans of dying men if you stood near the chimney at night. Eventually, the forest reclaimed it. The roof collapsed, the logs rotted, and the weeds grew over the foundation. The crawl space filled with water and mud, sealing the bones of the victims in the earth forever. The legend of Charles Kennedy grew with time. The story was told around campfires from Texas to Montana. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of the trail and the evil that men could hide behind a smiling face. But the physical reality of the man ended there, on the post in front of the saloon. The head remained there for months, slowly disintegrating until only the bleached skull remained, a white grin mocking the passers-by. The execution of Kennedy marked the end of the darkest chapter in the history of the Sangre de Cristo. The gold rush eventually faded. The town of Elizabethtown became a ghost town, and the mines collapsed. But the memory of the kill box remained. The pass where the cabin stood retained its ominous reputation. Even today, when the wind blows through the Moreno Valley carrying the scent of pine and rain, there is a chill in the air that has nothing to do with the temperature. It is the memory of the bones beneath the floorboards, the fire in the hearth, and the long, cold shadow of the man who built a house of death and paid for it with his head. Clay Allison went on to become a legend in his own right, a gunfighter whose exploits filled the dime novels. But those who knew him said he rarely spoke of that morning in October. It was a grim duty, a necessary act of sanitation. He had cut the cancer out of the valley. The image of him standing on the barrel, hammering the spike into the skull, became the defining image of frontier justice. Brutal, swift, and absolute. The law had failed, so the iron of the gunfighter and the rope of the lynch mob had stepped in to fill the void. The story of Charles Kennedy ends not with a courtroom gavel, but with the creak of a rope and the dull thud of a hammer. It ends with the silence of the grave and the wind sweeping over the empty valley. It is a story of American darkness, a reminder that in the vast, empty spaces of the West, a man could lose his soul and become a monster until the day the monster's wife ran out of the woods and brought the world crashing down on his head.